At midnight on December 3, 1984, an operator in Bhopal, India, watched a pressure gauge climb past the red line. No alarm. It had been disconnected. The cooling system was off to save money. The scrubber and flare tower were disabled. When the gas cloud boiled into the night, the public siren was silenced to avoid panic. This is the deep archive. We leave the surface behind. The hatch seals. Pressure builds as we descend into the sealed evidence. Court settlements that priced a human life at $550. Groundwater still poisoned by the plant's residues. Spirometer charts drawing the same flattened breath from mother to daughter. And the concrete slab of tank 610 still unrepaired, still waiting in the soil. The file on Bhopal is open. In the control room of the Union Carbide pesticide plant on the southern edge of Bhopal, the midnight shift had settled into its familiar quiet. It was a few minutes past 11:30 p.m. on December 2, 1984. The instrument panels glowed faintly, rows of analog dials and strip chart recorders humming at their stations, each one tracing a thin ink line across rolling paper. The operator on duty, a man who had worked at the plant for years, moved between the consoles with the slow economy of someone who had long ago stopped expecting anything to happen. He checked the pressure readings for the methyl isocyanate storage tanks, the 3 sunken steel vessels buried in a concrete bunker 200 yards from where he stood. Tanks 610, 611, and 619. Their numbers were stamped on brass plates riveted to the control panel, and on a normal night, the needles for all 3 would sit steady in the green zone, corresponding to an internal temperature just above freezing. That was the design specification, 0 degrees Celsius, the cold that kept the chemical quiet. But the refrigeration unit for tank 610 had been turned off 3 months earlier. The company had decided to save money on electricity. The temperature inside the tank had since risen to somewhere around 20 degrees Celsius, roughly the warmth of a room on a mild afternoon, and the needle for tank 610 had been drifting upward all evening. The operator noticed it. He tapped the glass. He noted the reading in his log. Then he moved on to other tasks because alarms of this kind had become so routine that they no longer functioned as warnings. The pressure gauge for tank 610 was climbing beyond its red line, and no alarm sounded, and no automatic system responded, because most of those systems were either broken, bypassed, or shut down for maintenance that had been scheduled weeks ago and never completed. Methyl isocyanate is not a substance that forgives warmth. Its boiling point is 39.1 degrees Celsius, just above human body temperature, which means that if you held a flask of it in your bare hand, it would begin to boil into gas before your palm registered the heat. In its liquid state, it is colorless and nearly as thin as water, with a sweet, sharp odor that some compare to burnt caramel. In its gaseous state, it is heavier than air and has a habit of hugging the ground, flowing downhill, filling low places the way a spilled liquid would, except that it is no longer liquid. It is a vapor that seeks the lungs of anyone lying on a cot, sleeping on a platform at a railway station, or crouching near the floor of a shanty to escape the smoke of a cooking fire. The Bhopal plant had been designed to take this chemical and react it with alpha-naphthol to produce carbaryl, an insecticide sold under the trade name Sevin, a white powder that American gardeners sprinkled on their tomato plants without a second thought. But methyl isocyanate itself was only the intermediate, the chemical stepping stone, and because it was too unstable to transport across public roads, the company had solved that problem by storing it in enormous quantities at the point of manufacture 40 metric tons per tank. 2 more tanks as backup. 120 tons of a compound that would rather be a gas than a liquid, sitting in a neighborhood where tens of thousands of people lived within a mile of the plant fence. The paradox was built into the concrete itself. Methyl isocyanate was considered too dangerous to move, so it was kept still. It was kept still in a city of 900,000 people, in a cluster of working-class neighborhoods known as Chola, JP, Nagar, and the railway colony, where families paid rent by the week and children slept 3 to a mattress. The plant's own operating manual recommended storing no more than a fraction of the capacity that was actually held in tanks 610, 611, and 619. But those recommendations had been written by engineers in West Virginia, and they had not survived the journey to Madhya Pradesh. The underground bunker that housed the tanks was surrounded by a chain-link fence, and beyond the fence was a road, and beyond the road were homes with corrugated metal roofs and open doorways and no air filtration of any kind. The people who lived there knew the plant produced something for farming. They knew it smelled strange when the wind shifted. They did not know the molecular formula of methyl isocyanate, or its boiling point, or the fact that when it met water it would react exothermically, generating heat that accelerated the reaction further, a self-feeding spiral that chemists call a runaway reaction. They knew only that the plant provided jobs, and that the air sometimes stung their eyes, and that the supervisors told them it was nothing. The night of December 2 was cool and still, with a light breeze from the northwest that would later turn the direction of the gas cloud into a matter of topography rather than chance. In the control room, the operator's logbooks recorded the pressure rise, but the recording instruments themselves had a history of unreliability. A Union Carbide safety audit in 1982, 2 years earlier, had identified more than 20 serious hazards at the Bhopal plant, including the risk of water entering the MIC storage tanks through a leaking valve. The audit report had recommended immediate corrective action. Most of those recommendations were never implemented. Some were marked as complete in internal paperwork, even though the physical repairs had never been done. The plant was losing money by then, running at a fraction of its production capacity, and Union Carbide had been actively trying to sell it to an Indian buyer. Safety upgrades were a cost item on a balance sheet that was already bleeding red ink. And so the refrigeration unit for tank 610 was shut down, and the vent gas scrubber was taken offline for maintenance, and the flare tower that was supposed to burn off escaping gas had its connecting pipe removed for repairs that were left unfinished. The plant's safety systems existed on paper, in the engineering diagrams and operating manuals that had been filed with the Indian government when the plant was approved. In physical reality, the systems were ghosts. The machinery was present, but its function had been canceled. At some point, after 9:30 p.m., a maintenance worker began washing out a section of pipe connected to the MIC storage system. The pipe led to a filtration unit, and the worker needed to clear a blockage, so he ran water through the line. He did not close a blind flange that would have prevented that water from traveling back toward the tanks. The water moved through the piping, following the path of least resistance, until it reached a valve that was supposed to have been sealed. The valve leaked. Water entered tank 610. A few hundred liters, perhaps less. It was enough. Methyl isocyanate reacts with water to produce heat, carbon dioxide, and a compound called methylamine, which is an irritant in its own right, but not the main danger. The danger was the heat, and the heat was not being removed by the dead refrigeration unit. The reaction began slowly, then accelerated. The pressure built. The liquid MIC inside the tank began to boil, and the boiling produced more gas, and the gas compressed, and the relief valve at the top of the tank was now the only path left for the rising pressure to escape. The relief valve was designed to channel gas into a scrubber filled with caustic soda, which would neutralize the MIC by converting it into harmless breakdown products. But the scrubber had been turned off. The flare tower, the next line of defense, had been disconnected. And so when the relief valve opened at 12:45 a.m. on December 3, the gas did not go to the scrubber or the flare. It went directly into the open air, a white plume rising above the plant and beginning its slow, heavy drift into the sleeping city. The operator in the control room saw the pressure spike. He checked the instruments again. He called his supervisor. The supervisor came, looked at the panel, and then walked outside to see what was happening. He saw the cloud rising from tank 610, pale against the darkness, and he understood something that the logbooks had not prepared him for. He ran to shut down the plant's public siren. The siren was the only direct way to warn the surrounding population, but the plant manager had decided that sounding it would cause unnecessary panic. The decision had been made years before, codified in a safety protocol that prioritized the company's relationship with the community over the community's need for information, and so the siren stayed silent. The cloud moved downhill toward the railway station where hundreds of people were sleeping on platforms, toward the narrow lanes of Chola where families had wrapped themselves in blankets against the December coolness, toward the open windows of homes that had no glass, only wooden shutters that did not close fully. The gas was invisible. It had a faint smell, sweet and acrid, but by the time anyone noticed it, they were already breathing it. Methyl isocyanate attacks the lungs by reacting with the water in living tissue to produce hydrochloric acid and ammonia, chemicals that corrode the delicate membranes of the alveoli and cause the lungs to fill with fluid. A person exposed to a high concentration does not simply struggle to breathe. They drown slowly in their own body's inflammatory response while fully conscious and aware of what is happening to them. The retention turn is not in the chemistry, although the chemistry is relentless. It is in the chain of decisions that led to that water entering tank 610. The water that entered the tank that night was supposed to have been impossible to reach the chemical inside. The piping diagram showed a blind flange in place. The maintenance procedures required that the line be isolated before washing. The safety audit had flagged the risk of water contamination specifically and had demanded that the problem be fixed. And yet the water entered. Not because of a freak accident or an unforeseeable event, but because someone had removed the blind flange and not replaced it, because someone had left the valve open, because someone had signed a work order authorizing the maintenance without verifying that the isolation procedure had been followed, because someone in a corporate office in the United States had approved a cost-cutting plan that eliminated the very redundancies that would have caught this chain of failures before it reached its conclusion. The question is not just how the water got in. It is who had disabled every system designed to keep it out, and why those decisions were made with full knowledge of what the chemical could do, and why the people who made those decisions were not in Bhopal that night and never had to breathe the air they had made lethal. The morning of December 3 dawned on a city that had become a field hospital. In the railway station, bodies lay on the platforms where they had fallen. In Chola, whole families were found in their homes, the parents dead, the children alive but with lungs already scarring into permanent fibrosis. The hospitals received patients by the thousands within the first hour, but the doctors had no information about what chemical they were treating. Union Carbide had not shared the specific toxicology of methyl isocyanate with the local health authorities, despite the fact that the plant was storing it by the ton within city limits. The company would later argue that the chemical formula was a trade secret and that revealing it would compromise its competitive advantage. The hospitals did their best with the tools they had. They administered oxygen. They gave antibiotics to prevent secondary infections. They watched patients die of a syndrome that had no name in any medical textbook, a combination of pulmonary edema, corneal ulceration, and systemic poisoning that left survivors with decades of chronic lung disease, neurological damage, and reproductive health problems that would be passed to their children. Tank 610 still exists, or rather, its concrete shell still exists. The plant was never fully demolished. The steel tank itself was emptied long ago, its contents either reacting to completion that night or being transferred to other vessels in the chaotic hours that followed. The refrigeration unit remains disconnected. The scrubber has not been restarted. The paperwork trail that could explain exactly who ordered which safety system to be taken offline is fragmented, scattered across corporate archives in the United States and court records in India, some of it destroyed, some of it sealed under settlement agreements. The archive of the disaster does not sit neatly in one place. It lives in the medical files of survivors, in the groundwater tests that still show contamination, in the settlement checks that were cashed decades ago and bought a few years of treatment before they ran out. It lives in the silent instruments of the control room, where the pressure gauge for tank 610 climbed beyond its red line and nobody sounded an alarm because the alarm was not broken. It was simply not connected to anything that would have heard it. The dust was the color of bone meal and smelled faintly of a chemistry set opened in a closed garage. In the suburban American hardware stores of the 1970s, it sat on shelves between the weed killer and the lawn fertilizer, packaged in bags no larger than a folded newspaper, printed with a green leaf and the word Sevin in confident block letters. The man who bought it on a Saturday morning in Cedar Rapids or Sacramento or Macon carried it to the register under one arm, paid a few dollars, and drove home to his tomato plants and his apple tree and his rose bushes, where he would tear the corner of the bag and shake a white film onto the leaves until the aphids stopped chewing. He did this without a mask, without gloves, without reading the fine print on the back. The fine print said nothing about a molecule so volatile it could not be shipped through the United States mail. That molecule was not the dust itself. The dust was carbaryl, a synthetic insecticide discovered in the middle years of the American century by a team of Union Carbide chemists who were looking for a way to kill insects without killing mammals by accident. The problem with the previous generation of pesticides was a problem of discrimination. The chemicals that worked best against agricultural pests worked almost as well against the farmers who spread them, and against the birds that ate the insects, and against the fish that swam downstream from the sprayed fields. Carbaryl was supposed to be different. It targeted the nervous systems of insects, blocking an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, causing paralysis and death at a dose that left vertebrates largely unharmed, and it degraded in sunlight and soil faster than its predecessors. By the time a child ate an apple from a tree treated with Sevin, the chemical had broken down into residues the human body could process and excrete. It was, by the standards of chemical agriculture in the 1950s, a merciful invention. But mercy in chemistry is a matter of intermediates, and the intermediate that made carbaryl possible was a substance called methyl isocyanate. Methyl isocyanate, MIC, in the shorthand of the plant floor, is a colorless liquid that boils at 39.1 degrees Celsius, barely above the temperature of a living human body. At room temperature, it evaporates eagerly. At the temperature of a summer afternoon in a factory building, it turns wholly into a gas that travels on the wind and seeks out moisture wherever it can find it. When MIC meets water, it reacts violently, producing heat and carbon dioxide, and a cascade of corrosive byproducts that sting and swell and scar any wet tissue they touch. The eyes, the nose, the throat, the delicate epithelium of the lungs. A single breath of concentrated MIC vapor is enough to trigger a chemical pneumonia that fills the alveoli with fluid, drowning the breather from the inside. For this reason, methyl isocyanate was classified from its earliest industrial development as a material too hazardous to transport by public road, by rail, or by air. It could travel only in dedicated pipelines, and only to the next stage of the process that would transform it immediately into something less dangerous. The chemists who designed the carbaryl synthesis knew this. They knew that MIC was the essential stepping stone, the molecule that made the whole reaction possible. The manufacturing route was elegant in its economy. Methylamine gas was combined with phosgene to produce MIC, and then the MIC was reacted with alpha-naphthol to yield carbaryl. There was no alternative pathway that skipped the MIC step without scrapping the entire method and starting over from first principles, which Union Carbide had no financial reason to do. Sevin was a commercial triumph. By the late 1960s, it was one of the most widely used insecticides in American agriculture, registered for application on more than 100 different crops, from cotton to cucumbers, and sold in every garden center and feed store in the country. The chemical that made it possible, the dangerous intermediate, was a cost of doing business, a process hazard to be managed by engineers and contained by hardware. And for a long time, in the plant at Institute, West Virginia, the managing and the containing worked. The decision to build a second MIC to carbaryl plant in Bhopal was made in the 1960s, in a period when the Indian government was actively courting foreign industrial investment under the banner of agricultural self-sufficiency. The Green Revolution was remaking the landscape of the subcontinent. New high-yield varieties of wheat and rice, imported from breeding programs in Mexico and the Philippines, were pushing grain harvests to levels India had never seen before. But the new crops demanded fertilizers and pesticides at a scale no traditional farming system could provide. The Indian state wanted domestic chemical manufacturing capacity to reduce dependence on expensive imports, and it was willing to offer favorable land leases, tax incentives, and regulatory accommodations to the Western companies that could build it. Union Carbide India Limited, a subsidiary of the American parent company, was chartered to construct a pesticide formulation plant on a plot of land near the city of Bhopal in the state of Madhya Pradesh, in the geographic center of the country. The site was chosen for its rail access, its water supply, and its distance from the power centers of Delhi and Bombay, a distance that also meant distance from the scrutiny that comes with proximity to government ministries and national newspapers. The original plant was small, designed only to mix and package carbaryl from imported ingredients. But in the late 1970s, the parent company reversed its supply chain and decided that the Bhopal facility would manufacture its own MIC on-site, rather than shipping the finished insecticide from the United States. The logic was economic, and the economic logic was, on paper, unassailable. Produce the intermediate where the labor was cheaper, where the final product would be sold, and where the regulatory environment was less expensive to comply with. The detailed engineering plans that Union Carbide's American designers had drawn up for the MIC unit in West Virginia, the redundant cooling systems, the computerized monitoring, the multiple backup scrubbers, and flare towers, were substantially simplified for the Bhopal plant. The reasoning given in internal documents was that the Indian facility would be operated at a smaller scale and that the cost of replicating the American safety systems would make the plant economically unviable. The Indian government, eager to see the factory expand and provide jobs, accepted the revised plans. No independent safety review was conducted by any Indian regulatory agency. The Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers filed the paperwork and stamped it approved, and the construction crews began pouring concrete. The paradox was built into the concrete before the first bag of Sevin dust ever rolled off the Bhopal production line. The insecticide that was supposed to protect crops, to reduce the suffering of hunger, to make Indian agriculture more productive and Indian food more abundant, required for its manufacture a chemical so dangerous that a single storage tank, if it were ever to fail, would release a cloud capable of killing more people in a single night than a decade of famines and crop failures could starve. The promise of the Green Revolution was a promise of life, written in the language of high-yield seeds and synthetic inputs. But the industrial infrastructure that delivered the pesticides also delivered the poison precursor that made them possible, and the infrastructure was built with tolerances that no American safety code would have allowed. The molecule at the center of the promise was indifferent to geography. The MIC stored in tank 610 inches. Bhopal was chemically identical to the MIC stored in tank 73 inches West Virginia. The difference was that the West Virginia tank was cooled by a refrigeration system with a backup generator, and the Bhopal tank's refrigeration had been shut off for months. The difference was that the West Virginia plant had a working scrubber and a working flare in a control room that could detect a pressure rise within seconds. The difference was that the West Virginia plant sat in a sparsely populated river valley, while the Bhopal plant sat at the edge of a city of 900,000 people, with a railway station and a market and a slum pressed right up against the perimeter fence. The difference was that the American plant was regulated and inspected, and the Indian plant was not. And the homeowner in Cedar Rapids, shaking Sevin dust onto his tomato plants on a July morning, knew none of this. He knew only that the bag said Sevin, and that the tomatoes last year had been full of holes from something that ate them before he could. The supply chain that ended in his garden, the molecule that made the white powder possible, had traveled from a place he could not find on a map, through a process he could not imagine, under conditions he would never be told about. The bag in his hand was a consumer good, labeled and priced and safe, and the long chain of decisions that had brought it to the hardware store shelf was invisible by design. The chain began in a tank in Bhopal, where methyl isocyanate sat warming in the dark, waiting to be piped to a reactor that would turn it into something harmless. The chain was legal, profitable, and globally integrated, and every link in it had been approved by people who understood, on some level, the nature of the chemical they were handling. The people who designed the process knew that MIC was the most hazardous substance in the pesticide industry. The people who sited the plant knew that it was surrounded by dense housing. The people who simplified the safety systems knew that the American originals existed for a reason. And the people who signed the agreements, in Connecticut and New Delhi and Bhopal, knew that the conditions under which the pesticide would be manufactured were conditions that would have been illegal in the country where the chemical was invented. The company that owned both sides of the equation had signed off on every difference. The signatures were on file in corporate ledgers and government archives, and they had been placed there years before the night when the air would turn chemical. The archive, in this sense, was complete before the disaster began. What was missing was not knowledge, but the will to act on it. And the question that legacy left was whether the absence of will was a failure of imagination or a line item in a budget that had already accounted for the cost of a life overseas as something less than a life at home. The bag of Sevin dust sat in the garden shed until fall, when the man spread the last of it on the ground beneath the apple tree and threw the empty bag in the trash. The trash went to a landfill, where the cardboard rotted and the ink faded and the trace residues of carbaryl washed into the soil with the rain. The soil didn't care. The molecule that had begun as methyl isocyanate in a city in central India had become, after its transformation, something that could be scattered by hand, something that could be bought with pocket change, something that could be forgotten in the ordinary course of a season. But the original molecule, in its unaltered form, was still there, still stored, still waiting in the tanks that held it. And the same economic logic that had put it there had also removed every barrier between that tank and the sleeping city around it. A removal that was not a mistake, but a series of deliberate choices, each one documented, each one rational, each one leading quietly toward the night when the tank would stop being a container and become a source. The insecticide promise was always a promise with an unspoken clause, and the clause was written in the fine print of a chemical nobody was meant to see. The lunchroom at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal was not a room so much as a corner of the warehouse where someone had placed a metal table and 4 plastic chairs. The walls were unpainted concrete, stained with the faint yellow bloom of chemical condensation that drifted through the plant even on quiet days. Workers ate their meals there in shifts, their food wrapped in cloth or newspaper, their voices low because complaining too loudly was known to reach the supervisor's ears before the end of the afternoon break. They told each other stories about the way their eyes burned when the wind came from the wrong direction, a stinging sensation that started in the tear ducts, spread across the conjunctiva, and lingered for hours after the shift ended, as if the air itself had been seeded with invisible needles. The supervisor said it was nothing, just a little irritation, nothing to worry about. The workers learned to stop asking. Between 1978 and the end of 1984, the Bhopal plant recorded at least 6 significant incidents involving methyl isocyanate. The numbers vary depending on which internal logbook one trusts, and many of the logbooks were later found to have pages missing, entries crossed out without signature, or dates that did not align with the maintenance records. A worker named Ashraf died in 1981 after inhaling a chemical cloud that escaped from a leak in a phosogene line. His death was recorded as an industrial accident, but no public investigation followed. Another leak in 1982 sent 25 laborers to the hospital with respiratory burns, and the plant manager at the time filed a report attributing the incident to operator error. The report did not mention that the operators had not been trained on the emergency shutdown procedure for the MIC unit, or that the training manuals themselves had been shipped from West Virginia and were written in English, a language most of the operators could not read beyond a technical vocabulary of valve names and pressure readings. In May of 1982, a safety team from Union Carbide's headquarters in the United States arrived in Bhopal for a routine inspection. They were senior engineers, familiar with the MIC production process, and they had access to every corner of the facility. Over the course of 3 days, they walked the length of the plant, peered into storage tanks, reviewed the maintenance logs, and interviewed the shift supervisors. Their final report, which ran to over 40 pages, identified 21 serious safety hazards. The hazards included the absence of a functioning high-temperature alarm on tank 610, a pressure indicator on tank 619 that had been broken for 6 months, a vent scrubber that was undersized for the volume of gas it might be required to neutralize in an emergency, and a pattern of water contamination entering the MIC storage area through a drainage system that had never been upgraded to meet the specifications of the original design. The report also noted that the refrigeration unit responsible for keeping the MIC at 0 degrees Celsius was operating intermittently and had been taken offline for repairs without a backup system in place. The recommendation was clear. These hazards constituted a risk of catastrophic failure, and they required immediate correction. None of the 21 hazards were fully corrected before December 1984. Some were partially addressed. A few were assigned to a maintenance team that never completed the work. Most were filed in a cabinet in the plant manager's office and referenced in quarterly budget meetings as items that would be addressed when the plant returned to profitability. By 1984, the Bhopal plant had been operating at a financial loss for 3 consecutive years. The global market for carbaryl had softened, and the Indian government had reduced its subsidy for domestic pesticide production, making the plant's output less competitive than imported alternatives. Union Carbide's corporate leadership in Danbury, Connecticut, had begun looking for a buyer for the facility, and the internal correspondence from that period, later obtained by investigators, shows that capital expenditure requests for safety upgrades were repeatedly denied on the grounds that the plant was no longer a long-term strategic asset. The logic was simple: why invest in a factory you intend to sell? The implications of that logic were less simple because the factory was still operating. It was still storing 40 metric tons of methyl isocyanate in an underground tank whose temperature gauge had not been calibrated in 18 months. The paradox that runs through this period is not hidden in confidential memos or locked boardrooms. It is visible in the difference between 2 facilities that were owned by the same company and produced the same chemical using the same fundamental process. The Union Carbide plant and Institute, West Virginia, had been designed with a layered safety architecture that included a dedicated flare tower capable of burning off the entire contents of an MIC storage tank in under an hour, a caustic scrubber with redundant pumps, a refrigerated storage system with automatic backup generators, and a computerized monitoring system that tracked temperature and pressure in real time and would trigger an automatic shutdown if any reading exceeded its safe range. The Bhopal plant, by contrast, had been designed with a single flare tower that was disconnected for pipe repairs in the weeks before the disaster, a scrubber that had to be manually activated by an operator who was not present in the control room during the night shift, a refrigeration unit that had been shut down 3 months earlier to save on electricity costs, and a monitoring system that relied on analog gauges that had to be read by eye and recorded on paper log sheets that were sometimes filled in hours after the readings were taken. This was not a failure of engineering. It was a deliberate simplification. The same corporate engineering division that had drawn up the specifications for Institute had drawn up the specifications for Bhopal, and the same executive review committee had approved them. The difference was not technical, it was financial. The Bhopal design removed the automatic systems, the redundancies, the computerized monitoring, and the high-capacity flare, because each of those components added cost to a plant that was already operating on thin margins in a price-sensitive market. The committee that approved the simplified design included men who would later testify before the Indian courts that they had never visited the Bhopal facility, that they had relied on local management to implement safety protocols, and that the responsibility for the decisions made in Bhopal rested with the Indian subsidiary, not with the parent corporation. The paper trail, however, showed that the capital expenditure requests for safety upgrades had to be signed off by executives in Connecticut, and the signatures on the denial letters were clear. The workers in the Bhopal lunchroom knew none of this. They knew only what their bodies told them. The burning sensation in the eyes was caused by methyl isocyanate molecules binding to the moisture on the surface of the cornea and hydrolyzing into monomethylamine and carbon dioxide, a reaction that releases heat and irritates the epithelial cells. The cough that followed was the respiratory tract's attempt to expel the same molecules from the trachea and bronchi before they could reach the deeper lung tissue. The headaches were probably caused by the accumulation of carbamylated proteins in the bloodstream, a process that inhibits enzymes essential to cellular metabolism. None of this was explained to the workers, and none of them had access to the toxicology data that Union Carbide's own laboratories had produced on the effects of chronic low-level MIC exposure. That data remained in a file at the company's research center, uncirculated, unshared with the Indian health authorities, unmentioned in the training materials that were distributed at the plant. The safety systems that failed at Bhopal were not merely broken, they had been systematically deactivated, bypassed, or removed. The high-temperature alarm on tank 610 had been disconnected because it triggered too frequently during the hot season when the ambient temperature in the storage area rose above the alarm set point. Rather than address the underlying problem, the failure of the refrigeration unit, the maintenance team had simply cut the alarm circuit. The caustic scrubber, which was the last line of defense between the MIC storage tanks and the atmosphere outside the plant, had been turned off for maintenance days before the leak and had not been restarted because the procedure for restarting it required a supervisor's authorization, and the supervisor responsible for that authorization had left for the day without signing the restart order. The water curtain system, a series of sprayers designed to neutralize escaping gas with a fine mist, had been installed at a height that was insufficient to reach a cloud of MIC vapor, which is heavier than air and travels close to the ground. This was a known design flaw flagged in the 1982 inspection report, and it was never corrected. The person who authorized the disconnection of the alarm and the deferral of the scrubber maintenance and the reduction of the refrigeration budget left a trail of memoranda that would eventually be presented as evidence in a courtroom in Bhopal. The documents showed a pattern of decisions in which safety expenditures were treated as discretionary costs rather than operational necessities, and the language of the memoranda was careful, couched in the neutral vocabulary of budget management and resource allocation. There were no smoking guns, no confessions of reckless indifference, no moments of villainous clarity. There were only spreadsheets, variance reports, and capital request forms stamped deferred in red ink. The strange part was not that the system failed. The strange part was that the system had been designed to allow these deferrals, to absorb them into the normal flow of corporate accounting, to render them invisible even to the people who signed off on them. By the time the last alarm was disconnected, no single individual had made a decision to endanger the city of Bhopal. What had happened was more banal and more terrifying, an accumulation of small, rational, financially justified choices that collectively removed every barrier between the chemical and the city, one downgrade at a time. When the courtroom finally convened years later, the question of who knew what and when would become the central engine of the litigation. The paper trail pointed upward, from the plant floor to the subsidiary management to the corporate headquarters. But the legal structure of the multinational corporation dispersed responsibility across jurisdictional lines, so that the person who authorized the deferral of the scrubber maintenance was not the same person who approved the simplified safety design. And neither of them was the person who decided to store 40 metric tons of MIC in a tank without a working refrigeration unit. The courtroom became a hall of mirrors in which every defendant pointed to someone else. Every document was open to interpretation, and every engineer who testified could honestly say that they had not intended for any of this to happen. They had only been doing their jobs, managing their budgets, meeting their quarterly targets, and signing the forms that were placed in front of them. The safety systems had been removed, not by malice, but by arithmetic, and the arithmetic had been approved by men who would never breathe the air of Bhopal. By the late autumn of 1984, the plant had become a ghost of its original design. The MIC storage area was staffed by a skeleton crew. The instrumentation was failing faster than it could be repaired, and the remaining workers had developed a quiet fatalism about the leaks and the odors and the burning eyes. They still gathered in the lunchroom, but the stories had changed. They no longer complained about the irritation. They compared notes on which shift had the worst exposure, which wind direction brought the heaviest smell, which supervisor was most likely to dismiss their concerns. They had learned to read the plant not by its instruments, but by its sounds. The hum of the pumps, the hiss of the vents, the silence that meant something had stopped working. It was a form of knowledge that existed nowhere in the training manuals. A sensory archive built from years of breathing, the air that the company had told them was safe. On the night of December 2, 1984, that archive was the only warning system still functioning, and the silence that descended on tank 610 inches, the hours before midnight, was the silence of a plant that had been stripped of every other way of knowing that something was wrong. The control room at the Bhopal plant was never quiet in the way that sleep is quiet. It was quiet in the way that a fever patient is quiet, the surface still, but the numbers moving underneath. The needles trembling on their dials, the logbooks filling with small deviations that nobody had ever been paid to investigate. On the night of December 2, 1984, the midnight shift came on at 11:00 p.m. The plant was running at reduced capacity, producing only a trickle of the carbaryl insecticide that had once justified its existence. Tank 610, one of 3 underground storage vessels for methyl isocyanate, held approximately 40 metric tons of the chemical, more than the plant's own operating manual recommended, but within the range that had become normal over years of cost-cutting and quiet compromises. The refrigeration unit, designed to keep the MIC at 0 degrees Celsius, had been shut down 3 months earlier. The temperature inside the tank had climbed to around 20 degrees, well above the boiling point of the chemical it was supposed to contain. The operator who noticed the first anomaly was a man whose name would later appear in court documents and then disappear from them, one of dozens of workers whose testimony would be taken and set aside. He was making his rounds when he saw that the pressure gauge on tank 610 was reading 2 pounds per square inch, low, almost negligible, but higher than it should have been for a tank that was supposed to be sealed and stable. He made a note in the log. He did not sound an alarm. The plant had taught him, over years of minor leaks and unexplained readings, that strange numbers were not emergencies. They were the background noise of a facility that was slowly falling apart, and you learned to live with the noise, or you found another job. The shift supervisor was informed. He checked the gauge himself, then made a decision that would later be parsed in legal briefs and commission reports until the words lost their meaning. He told the operator to wait and watch. The pressure was climbing, but slowly. There was time. There was always time. By 11:30 p.m., the workers in the MIC control room began to notice a new sensation, a faint burning in their eyes, a tightness in the throat that came and went. They had felt this before. The plant had a history of small gas releases, none large enough to trigger a formal report, but all of them large enough to remind the men who worked there that the chemicals they handled did not respect the boundary between the inside of a pipe and the inside of a lung. One worker later told investigators that he had complained to his supervisor about the irritation weeks earlier, and the supervisor had told him it was nothing, just a little leak, nothing to worry about. The worker had accepted this explanation because it was easier to accept than the alternative, which was that the plant where he earned his living was slowly poisoning him, and nobody with the power to fix it was going to. The water that entered tank 610 that night almost certainly came through a leaking valve in a pipe that connected the MIC storage system to a nitrogen pressurization line. The valve was supposed to be closed. It was supposed to be checked. It was supposed to be impossible for water to reach the chemical inside the tank. But the plant's maintenance records, which would later be examined by investigators from 3 countries, showed that the valve had not been properly inspected in months, that the blind flange designed to physically block the line had been removed during earlier repair work and never replaced, and that the isolation valves that could have prevented backflow were not fully seated. The water did not rush into the tank. It seeped slowly, steadily, a few liters at a time, and when it met the methyl isocyanate, it began a reaction that was as predictable as it was catastrophic. Methyl isocyanate reacts with water to produce heat, carbon dioxide, and a cascade of chemical intermediates that accelerate the reaction further. The boiling point of MIC is 39.1 degrees Celsius, a number that belongs in a chemistry textbook, but that on this night became the difference between a contained industrial process and an uncontained release of toxic gas. As the water and the MIC combined, the temperature inside the tank began to rise. The rising temperature increased the reaction rate. The increasing reaction rate generated more heat. The carbon dioxide produced by the reaction increased the pressure. By midnight, the temperature in tank 610 had passed the boiling point of MIC, and the liquid inside the tank was beginning to transform into a gas that was looking for a way out. The plant had 3 systems designed to prevent exactly this scenario. The first was the refrigeration unit, which would have kept the MIC cold enough to suppress any exothermic reaction before it could become self-sustaining. It was off. The second was the Venturi scrubber, a tower filled with caustic soda solution that was designed to neutralize any MIC gas that escaped from the tanks by chemically converting it into harmless compounds. The scrubber had been taken out of service for maintenance earlier in the week, and the maintenance had not been completed. It was off. The third was the flare tower, a tall stack with a pilot flame at the top that was supposed to burn off any gas that made it past the scrubber, breaking down the MIC molecules into carbon dioxide, water, and nitrogen before they could reach the open air. The flare tower had been disconnected because a section of its connecting pipe had corroded and was being replaced. The pipe was on the ground. The flare was dark. 3 systems, 3 failures. None of them were accidents in the sense that a bolt shears or a gasket blows without warning. All of them were decisions. Decisions to defer maintenance, decisions to save money, decisions to accept a level of risk that had been calculated in a conference room thousands of miles away and passed down through memos that no worker on the night shift had ever seen. The control room instruments began to show pressure readings that were no longer within the range of normal variation. By 12:15 a.m., the pressure in tank 610 had risen to 10 pounds per square inch. By 12:30 a.m., it was past 30 pounds and climbing. The temperature inside the tank was now well over 200 degrees Celsius, and the concrete dome that covered the underground vessel was beginning to vibrate with the force of the reaction happening beneath it. The workers in the control room could hear it now, a low rumble, a sound that one survivor later described as a train passing underneath the floor, except there was no train, and there was no floor thick enough to contain what was about to happen. The plant manager was awakened at his home a short distance from the facility. He was told that tank 610 was showing abnormal pressure readings. He later testified that he assumed it was another false alarm, another minor leak of the kind that had become routine. He told the caller to monitor the situation and call him back if it got worse. He did not leave his house. At 12:45 a.m., the pressure inside tank 610 exceeded the set point of the pressure relief valve. The valve was designed to open at 40 pounds per square inch to prevent the tank from rupturing catastrophically, a safety measure of last resort that was supposed to vent gas into the scrubber system, which was supposed to neutralize it before sending it to the flare tower, which was supposed to burn it. But the scrubber was off. The flare was disconnected. The pressure relief valve opened directly to the atmosphere through a vent pipe that rose 33 meters above the ground, and when it opened, the gas that had been building inside tank 610 for 2 hours found its exit. The sound was not subtle. Workers across the plant described it as a shriek, a high-pitched scream of pressurized gas that cut through the night air and kept going. The plant manager, still at home nearly a mile away, heard it. He later said that he knew immediately something was wrong, not a minor leak, not a false alarm, and he began to dress. By the time he reached the plant, the cloud was already visible above the vent pipe, white and thick, illuminated by the floodlights that ringed the storage area, rising into the darkness, and then, because MIC gas is heavier than air, beginning to sink. This is the detail that the engineering reports cannot fully capture. The cloud did not rise and disperse like smoke from a chimney. It rose only until its temperature equalized with the surrounding air, and then it fell. It moved across the ground like a slow avalanche, following the contours of the land, filling the low places first, the drainage ditches, the shantytown gullies, the railway underpass where homeless families slept on cardboard because they had nowhere else to sleep. The gas was invisible once it left the floodlights, but it was not gone. It was moving at walking speed through neighborhoods where the population density was among the highest in the city, where homes were built from corrugated metal and mud brick, where windows had no glass and doors had no seals, and where tens of thousands of people were asleep. The workers who survived the plant that night were the ones who ran toward the leak. This is not a metaphor or a eulogy. It is a statement of fact, recorded in the testimony of the survivors and the bodies of the dead. The men in the control room did not evacuate immediately. They tried to activate the scrubber, not knowing it was empty. They tried to restart the refrigeration unit, not knowing it had been drained of coolant months ago. They searched for the emergency water curtain that was supposed to create a spray barrier to knock down escaping gas. But the water curtain had been designed for a release rate far below what was now coming out of the vent pipe, and the spray nozzles reached only 15 meters, less than half the height of the stack from which the gas was escaping. The safety systems that had been designed for the plant, the systems that would have been required at an American facility producing the same chemical, were either absent, broken, or designed for a scenario that had already been exceeded. At 1:00 a.m., the shift supervisor finally ordered the general alarm to be sounded. But the plant's siren, which was supposed to alert the surrounding community to a chemical release, was not activated. The plant manager, who had arrived at the facility by then, made the decision to turn it off after a brief initial blast. He later explained that he did not want to cause panic. The siren was loud and would wake the entire city, and he believed, or hoped, that the leak would be contained quickly, that the cloud would disperse harmlessly, that the situation was still under control. He was wrong about all of these things, but by the time he understood how wrong he was, the siren was silent and the cloud was already 2 miles downwind. The gas moved through Chola first, then JP, Nagar, then the railway station where a train from Delhi had just arrived and passengers were sleeping on the platforms waiting for morning connections. It moved through the narrow lanes where families slept on charpoy beds outside their homes because the December nights were cool and the air was usually clean. It moved through the hutments where day laborers and rickshaw pullers and vegetable sellers lived with their children and their parents and their neighbors, packed together in conditions that were not chosen but inherited. The geography of a city that had grown around a factory, the way scar tissue grows around a wound. The first symptom was a burning in the eyes, a sensation that began as irritation and quickly became agony, as the MIC dissolved in the moisture of the tear film and began to hydrolyze into corrosive compounds. The second symptom was a cough, a deep involuntary spasm as the gas reached the lungs and began to react with the water in the alveolar membranes. The third symptom, for those who inhaled enough of the cloud, was pulmonary edema, the slow filling of the lungs with fluid, the drowning that happens from the inside, the sensation of breathing that produces less and less oxygen until the body simply stops. People woke to the sound of their own coughing, or to the sound of their children coughing, or to the silence of a family member who had stopped breathing and lay still on the floor beside them. They ran into the streets, which was the worst thing they could do. The concentration of gas was higher outside, where the cloud was still moving through. But they did not know this. They could not know this. The plant's siren was silent. The police had not been notified. The hospitals had received no warning about what chemical had been released or how to treat it. The city of Bhopal, population of nearly 1 million, was breathing a chemical weapon that had been designed to kill insects by attacking their respiratory systems, and no one in a position of authority had yet decided what to say or how to say it. The cloud that rose from tank 610 that night did not drift slowly. It moved with purpose, driven by the slight northwest wind and the density of the gas itself, a heavier-than-air blanket that sought the lowest ground and filled it. It reached the railway station at approximately 1:30 a.m., where it settled into the underpasses and the waiting areas and the cheap hotels where travelers had paid a few rupees for a bed. It reached the Jayaprakash Nagar housing colony, a working-class neighborhood of government-built homes where families who had never worked at the Union Carbide plant and had never benefited from its presence found their bedrooms filling with a gas they could not see and could not name. By 2:00 a.m., the cloud had traveled more than 3 miles from the plant, and within its path, a dense corridor of the most heavily populated parts of the city. Approximately 400,000 people were exposed to a concentration of methyl isocyanate, that would later be estimated at between 20 and 100 parts per million, many times the level considered immediately dangerous to life. The release from tank 610 continued for nearly 2 hours. When it finally stopped, when the pressure inside the tank had dropped enough for the relief valve to close, the concrete dome above the vessel was hot to the touch, and the air around the plant stank of something that smelled, one survivor said, like burning chili peppers mixed with new-mown hay, a combination that would never again be neutral for anyone who had smelled it that night. The workers who had run toward the leak were now running away from it, their eyes swollen shut, their lungs burning, their uniforms soaked with sweat and chemical residue. Some of them would survive, some would not. The ones who survived would spend the rest of their lives being asked the same question by lawyers and journalists and investigators. What did you know? And when did you know it? And why didn't you warn anyone? The question was fair, but it was also insufficient. The workers on the night shift had known that the pressure was rising, but they had not known that the scrubber was empty, or that the flare was disconnected, or that the refrigeration unit had been off for 3 months. They had known that something was wrong, but they had been trained for years to treat wrongness as normal, to accept small failures as the cost of keeping the plant running, to believe that the people who had designed the system must have known what they were doing. They were wrong about that last part. The people who had designed the system had known exactly what they were doing, and they had done it thousands of miles away, in a country where the same plant would have been required to have redundant safety systems and automatic alarms and emergency response plans that were rehearsed, not just written. The gap between what the workers knew and what the company knew was the same gap that separated the sleeping families from the siren that never sounded, the hospital doctors from the information that could have saved their patients, and the city of Bhopal from the legal and moral accountability that would remain forever out of reach. The morning of December 3 broke over a city that had been transformed. The cloud had dissipated by dawn, its molecules dispersed or hydrolyzed or absorbed into the soil and the water and the bodies of the people who had breathed it. But the evidence of what had happened was everywhere. In the streets where bodies lay wrapped in cloth, in the hospitals where corridors were packed with patients who could not stop coughing, in the animal carcasses that littered the roads, in the silence of neighborhoods where the only sound was the crying of survivors who had lost everyone they loved in the space of a few hours. The night shift was over. The day shift was about to begin. And the cloud, which had already done its work, was now a memory that would take decades to decompose. It begins not with a sound, but with a scent, faint at first, like burnt hay mixed with something sharper, something that stings the back of the throat before the mind can name it. In the narrow lanes of Chola, where families slept on woven mats laid across packed earth floors, the first to wake were not those who heard anything but those who opened their eyes already coughing, already reaching for water that would not help. The air outside the windows had turned a pale, milky white, the color of cataract, and it was moving downhill from the plant along the contours of the land with the patience of something that did not need to hurry because it had already arrived. The cloud knew nothing and intended nothing. It was heavier than the surrounding atmosphere, so it hugged the ground the way fog hugs a river valley, filling the low places first, seeping through gaps in door frames and cracks in walls, settling into the basements and ground floor rooms where the poorest families lived because those were the spaces closest to the earth. That was the second cruel fact of the night. Methyl isocyanate vapor is approximately 1.5 times denser than air at the same temperature, which meant that the people with the fewest resources lived at the elevation where the gas was most concentrated, And they breathed it first, and they breathed it deepest. To understand what happened inside their lungs in those first minutes, you have to understand something about the chemistry of methyl isocyanate that the plant's safety manuals described in technical language, but that the residents of Chola had never been given the chance to read. MIC is not a poison in the way that cyanide is a poison, interrupting the blood's ability to carry oxygen. It is a corrosive agent, a molecule that reacts violently with water, any water, to produce a cascade of secondary compounds, methylamine, dimethylurea, and most damaging of all, carbon dioxide and heat, and a family of irritant chemicals that strip the lining from the respiratory tract, the way a solvent strips paint from old wood. The human lung is approximately 80% water by weight. The surface of the eye is a wet membrane. The lining of the throat, the bronchial passages, the tiny air sacs called alveoli, where oxygen crosses into the bloodstream, all of these are moist surfaces, designed to be moist, dependent on moisture for their function. When MIC vapor touches that moisture, it does not simply dissolve, it reacts. It transforms water into hydrochloric acid, into ammonia, into compounds that burn and blister and swell. The alveoli are the end of the respiratory line, microscopic chambers arranged in clusters like the cells of a honeycomb, each one wrapped in a net of capillaries so fine that red blood cells must pass through them in single file. Their walls are delicate. They have to be. Gas exchange across a thick barrier is slow, and the body cannot afford slow oxygen. Under a microscope, a healthy alveolus looks like a tiny empty sac, its walls thin enough to be almost transparent. Under a microscope 48 hours after exposure to MIC vapor, the same structure is unrecognizable. The walls are thickened with inflammatory fluid. The interior space is filled with cellular debris and protein-rich edema, and the capillary beds around it are leaking plasma into the air spaces. The patient is breathing, but the oxygen is not crossing into the blood. The patient is, in a clinical sense that is precise and terrible and true, drowning from the inside while lying on dry ground. The city of Bhopal on the night of December 2, 1984, contained approximately 800,000 people. Of those, roughly 400,000 lived within the path of the cloud, a plume that stretched downwind from the Union Carbide plant along a vector determined entirely by the prevailing breeze and the topography of the city. The neighborhoods that received the highest exposure: Chola, JP, Nagar, the area around the railway station, were working-class districts where families lived in small masonry houses or informal structures of wood and corrugated metal, the kind of architecture that offers privacy but almost no seal against the outside air. The plant's own safety assessment, conducted years earlier, had identified these neighborhoods as the zones of maximum vulnerability in the event of a major release. But that document was filed away in a cabinet somewhere, and the people who lived in those neighborhoods were never told that their proximity to the plant was a calculation that had been made and set aside. The early symptoms arrived in a sequence that would later become familiar to the doctors who treated them, but that, on that first night, was utterly disorienting. First came the ocular pain, a burning sensation in the eyes, as though someone had squeezed lemon juice into them, followed by uncontrollable tearing that did not relieve the sting but only spread it across the cheeks and eyelids. Then the respiratory irritation, a cough that started dry and became wet within minutes, a tightness in the chest that made each breath feel shallow and insufficient, a sensation that survivors would later describe as breathing through a wet cloth. Then the panic, because panic is a physiological response to suffocation, and the body knows it is suffocating before the mind can understand why. The strange part was not that the symptoms were severe, but that they were unfamiliar. In a city where respiratory complaints were common, dust from unpaved streets, smoke from cooking fires, industrial pollution from dozens of small factories, the sensation of MIC exposure was qualitatively different. And the difference was what caused so many people to make the decision that killed them. They believed they were dying from a disease, a sudden plague that had descended on their neighborhood without warning. And the instinct in the face of an unknown epidemic is to flee, to get out of the house, to find air, to run. The streets of Chola at 1:30 a.m. on December 3, filled with hundreds of people who had woken from sleep to find their chests closing and their vision blurring, and they ran, and every step they ran they inhaled more of the cloud, and their lungs filled faster with the fluid that was their own body's response to the chemical, and they collapsed in the streets, at the railway station, on the steps of the mosque, in the doorways of shops that were locked and shuttered because it was the middle of the night and nobody was coming to open them. Some of them died there in the street, with the white fog still swirling around their bodies. Others managed to reach the hospitals, or what passed for hospitals in the first chaotic hour, and that was when the second disaster began. There was a siren. The plant had a siren installed as part of its emergency response system, designed to alert the surrounding community in the event of a major chemical release. It was loud enough to be heard for miles. It had been tested before, and the people of the surrounding neighborhoods knew what it meant, or at least they knew that it meant something: danger, evacuation, the need to cover their faces and move away from the plant. At some point in the minutes after the pressure relief valve opened and the cloud began to rise from tank 610, someone at the plant made a decision, and that decision was to turn the siren off. The plant manager, or someone acting under his authority, concluded that the sound of the siren would cause panic, that the public alarm system was more dangerous than the chemical release itself, that it was better to let the cloud move silently through the sleeping city than to risk the disorder that might follow a warning. The siren was silenced. The public address system that was supposed to broadcast instructions was not used. The police were not called. The hospitals were not contacted. The paradox sits at the center of this night, like a stone in a river. The very systems designed to protect the population were deactivated by the people who operated them, not out of malice but out of a calculus that prioritized order over information. And the result was that the first responders, the police constables who ran toward the cloud, the taxi drivers who loaded coughing strangers into their vehicles, the nurses who opened the doors of the Hamidiya hospital to find a wave of bodies, had no idea what they were walking into. They breathed the same air. They inhaled the same chemical. Many of them became patients themselves within hours. Hamidiya Hospital was the largest medical facility in Bhopal, a public hospital with approximately 600 beds and a staff that had been trained to handle the usual urban afflictions: tuberculosis, dysentery, road accidents, childbirth complications. At 2:00 a.m., its emergency ward began to fill with patients who had the same cluster of symptoms: burning eyes, coughing, respiratory distress, vomiting, blindness, and within the first hour, the number of patients exceeded the number of beds, and the hallways became wards, and the floors became triage zones. And the hospital's supply of oxygen and bronchodilators, and even basic saline solution, was exhausted well before dawn. The doctors did what doctors do in the absence of information. They treated the symptoms they could see. They gave oxygen. They administered steroids to reduce inflammation. They tried to clear the fluid from the lungs of patients who were choking on it. Some of the treatments helped, many did not. None of the doctors knew that mic reacts with water, which meant that some of the interventions they attempted, nebulized saline, steam inhalation, may have made the damage worse by providing more water for the chemical reaction to consume. Union Carbide had not told them. This is not an accusation. It is a documented fact that appears in court records and investigation reports. The company had not provided the local health authorities with any information about the specific toxicity of methyl isocyanate, its mechanism of injury, its breakdown products, or its recommended treatment protocol. The Material Safety Data Sheet for MIC, the document that would have listed these things, was on file at the plant, but it had never been shared with the hospitals, and in any case, the information it contained was designed for industrial settings where exposures were assumed to be small and contained, not for a city where hundreds of thousands of people were breathing the raw vapor simultaneously. The Indian Council of Medical Research did not receive its first written guidance about MIC poisoning from Union Carbide until December 5, 2 days after the leak, and by then, the acute phase of the disaster was over, and the dead had already been counted. The number of dead is a ledger that has been kept by different hands with different methods, and the sums do not match. The government of Madhya Pradesh, the Indian state of which Bhopal is the capital, recorded 2,259 deaths in its initial count. Amnesty International, conducting its own investigation in the months after the disaster, concluded that at least 8,000 people died in the first 2 weeks. The survivor organizations in Bhopal, the groups that formed in the days after the cloud lifted and that have been counting ever since, estimate that between 15,000 and 25,000 people have died over the 4 decades since the disaster from illnesses directly attributable to the gas. The gap between these numbers is not a rounding error. It is a record of who was counted and who was not, who died in a hospital with a death certificate, and who died on a street or in a shack or years later from lung failure that was never formally traced back to the night of December 3. But the counting came later. In the first hour, there was only the cloud and the city, and the silence where the siren should have been, and the bodies that were already beginning to accumulate in the places where people had gone to seek safety and found none. The Bhopal railway station was one of those places. It was a major stop on the Indian rail network, and on the night of the leak, it was filled with travelers who had arrived late and decided to sleep on the platform rather than look for lodging in an unfamiliar city. When the cloud reached the station, it settled into the waiting areas in the ticket hall, and the people who had been sleeping on the floor woke in the same condition as the residents of Chola, and they died in the same way, but many of them carried no identification, and their bodies were taken to the morgue without names, and their families in distant cities did not learn what had happened to them for weeks. The station became a site of particular horror, not because the suffering there was worse than elsewhere, but because it was so random. People who had never intended to be in Bhopal, who had no connection to the plant or its products, who had simply chosen the wrong night to change trains and the wrong place to lay their heads. The archives of that night are filled with details that serve no narrative purpose except to make the scale of the disaster feel real, and perhaps that is the only scale that matters. The number of livestock that died in the fields around the plant, dogs, cows, goats, birds falling from the sky mid-flight because their respiratory systems were smaller and more vulnerable than human lungs. The number of dead insects found on windowsills in the morning, the very creatures that Sevin had been designed to kill, now killed by a precursor of the same pesticide. The number of people who were blinded permanently in one or both eyes, their corneas clouded over with scar tissue that no surgery could repair. The number of children who survived the night but whose lungs never developed normally afterward, who grew into adults with the pulmonary function of 60-year-olds, who coughed every morning of their lives and would continue to cough until they died. One family, in a single room in Chola, sleeping in the arrangement that poverty dictates, children on a mat near the door, parents on a cot against the wall, the youngest child in the mother's arms. The mother wakes first because the burning in her eyes is so intense that she thinks something has bitten her, some insect, some scorpion that crawled into the bedding while she slept. She opens her eyes and cannot see. The room is white, but the whiteness is not light. It is something material, something that moves when she waves her hand through it. She screams, and the sound wakes the father, who starts coughing immediately, and the children are coughing too. And the youngest is struggling to breathe with a sound that is not quite a cry, not quite a gasp, but something in between that the father will hear in his memory for the rest of his life. He pulls them all through the door, and the street outside is worse. The fog is thicker, and he cannot see which direction to run, and the neighbors are running in all directions. And somewhere in the distance, a man is shouting that it is the end of the world, that the sky has fallen, that everyone is going to die. The father does not believe that the world is ending, but he believes that his family is dying, and that belief is correct enough. He finds a cart, or a neighbor with a cart, or he simply carries one child in each arm and tells the eldest to hold on to his shirt and keep walking no matter what, and they move through the white streets toward the only place he can think of, the hospital, the place where sick people go. When they arrive, the hospital is already full, and the nurses are already exhausted, and the doctors are already making decisions about who can be saved and who cannot, based on nothing more than a glance at the color of the patient's lips and the sound of the patient's breathing. The father and his children are triaged and given oxygen and told to wait, and they wait, and the mother is somewhere else in the building, or she is still on the street, or she is already dead. The father does not know, and will not know for 3 more days, and when he learns the answer, it will not be from a doctor, but from a neighbor who found her body near the mosque and helped carry it to one of the mass cremation sites that the city had set up because the morgue had run out of space. The hospitals of Bhopal that night functioned as a kind of laboratory for a chemical exposure that no medical textbook had ever described, and the data they generated, the symptoms, the progression of the disease, the response to various treatments, were recorded in handwritten notes and later compiled into studies that would become the foundation of the world's knowledge about MIC poisoning. But the doctors who generated that data did not think of themselves as researchers. They thought of themselves as doctors, and they were drowning, not in the clinical sense that the chemical produced in its victims, but in the ordinary sense of being overwhelmed by need that exceeded capacity. One physician at Hamidiya Hospital later told a journalist that he had performed more autopsies in the week after the disaster than he had performed in his entire career before that night, and that after a certain point, he stopped being able to remember individual bodies and began to see only patterns, the same fluid in the lungs, the same erosion of the airway lining, the same expression on faces that had died in the act of trying to breathe. The quiet implication of that night, The detail that sits in the back of the throat like the ghost of the cloud itself is that none of this was a secret. The danger of MIC was known. The potential for a catastrophic release had been modeled and calculated and written down in safety audits that collected dust in filing cabinets. The neighborhood maps that showed the high exposure zones had been prepared by engineers who understood what a worst-case scenario would look like. The decision to turn off the siren was made by a human being who had a reason. And the reason was written in a logic of cost and liability and public relations that made sense within the narrow frame of the plant's interests, but that collapsed into monstrosity the moment it met the wider frame of the city that was breathing. The city slept, and then it woke, and then it learned that waking was not the same as surviving. The cloud dissipated with the morning sun, as MIC vapor reacts with water in the atmosphere and degrades over time, and by noon on December 3, the air was clear enough to breathe without dying. But the damage was already done, and the questions that would follow about who knew what, about who owed what to whom, about whether the settlement of accounts would ever balance, were already taking shape in the hospital wards and the morgues and the streets where families were beginning to realize that the night had taken something from them that no morning would ever return. The archive of that night is kept in the lungs of the survivors, in the scar tissue that forms when alveoli heal imperfectly, and every breath they have taken for the past 4 decades has been a record of the moment when the air turned chemical and the siren stayed silent and the city learned, too late, that the information that might have saved them had existed all along in a room full of people who chose not to share it. The farmer's name was Gurpreet Singh, and in the summer of 1983 he was 42 years old, a Sikh from the Ludhiana district whose family had worked the same 30 acres since the partition. In the photograph his son took that year, a borrowed camera, a wedding gift, he stands at the edge of his wheat field holding a white plastic backpack sprayer, its wand raised like a benediction over the green shoots. The tank contained carbaryl mixed with water at the recommended dilution, and the mist drifted back across his bare forearms as he walked the rows. He wore no mask, no gloves, no goggles. He had never been told he needed any of these things. The label on the sack of Sevin dust in his storage shed was printed in English, a language he could not read, and the pictograms that might have warned him, a skull, 2 crossed bones, a figure with hands pressed to its face, had been omitted from the Indian packaging as an unnecessary expense. He complained of headaches that summer, and nausea that came in the late afternoons, and a burning in his throat that made the evening meal taste of metal. He attributed these things to the heat. The heat in Punjab in June is a physical presence, a weight on the chest, and it seemed reasonable that a man working outdoors from dawn to dusk would feel his body protest. He did not connect his symptoms to the white powder he measured into the sprayer tank each morning, or to the factory in Bhopal, 700 miles to the south, where the same molecule was being produced in quantities so vast that it had to be stored underground in tanks cooled to just above freezing, because at body temperature it would turn into a gas that could kill a man in under a minute. The Green Revolution came to India with the force of a theological argument. It did not ask permission. It arrived in the form of seed and fertilizer and pesticide, and it spoke the language of arithmetic, tons per hectare, mouths per family, rupees per kilo. The man who brought it was Norman Borlaug, an American agronomist whose work on dwarf wheat varieties had already transformed Mexican agriculture in the 1950s, and who believed, with the fervor of a man who had seen children starve, that the only moral response to hunger was abundance. In 1963, at the invitation of the Indian government, Borlaug shipped 100 kilograms of his high-yield wheat seeds to the Punjab, and within 5 years, India's wheat harvest had nearly doubled. By the early 1970s, the country was self-sufficient in food grains for the first time since independence. The famines that British colonial policy had made routine, the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed 3 million people while grain was exported to feed the Allied war effort, seemed to belong to a different century. But the new seeds were hungry in ways that the old seeds had not been. They demanded nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium applied on a schedule. They demanded irrigation, which meant canals and tube wells, and the slow drawing down of aquifers that had taken millennia to fill. And they demanded protection from stem rust, from aphids, from bollworms, from the 1,000 small mouths that had evolved alongside the crops and that now found themselves presented with a monoculture feast, mile after mile of genetically identical plants. A landscape designed for efficiency that was also a landscape designed for infestation. The insecticide that protected those fields was carbaryl, a carbamate compound that kills insects by disrupting their nervous systems, specifically by inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Without that enzyme, acetylcholine builds up in the synapses, causing continuous neural firing, paralysis, and death. It is a clean mechanism, elegant in its brutality, and it works on insects at doses that, in theory, should not harm humans. Because human acetylcholinesterase is slightly different in structure from the insect version, and because humans are much larger, and because the exposure levels from spraying a field are far lower than the exposure levels required to cause acute poisoning. In theory, in the fields of Punjab in 1983, Gurpreet Singh was not working in theory. The molecule that made all of this possible, the essential precursor without which carbaryl could not be synthesized at industrial scale, was methyl isocyanate, a molecule of 7 atoms, 2 carbons, 3 hydrogens, 1 nitrogen, 1 oxygen, a molecular weight of 57, a boiling point of 39.1 degrees Celsius, a vapor heavier than air. At room temperature, a clear liquid with a sharp, unpleasant odor. At body temperature, a gas that seeks out moisture, the moisture in eyes, in lungs, in mucous membranes, and reacts with it exothermically, releasing heat and forming corrosive byproducts that eat through tissue. To make carbaryl, you react methyl isocyanate with alpha-naphthol, and the reaction is fast, efficient, and irreversible, which is exactly what industry wants from a synthesis step. The problem is, what happens when the reaction runs in the wrong direction, when the chemical meets water instead of naphthol, when the heat builds faster than the cooling can carry it away? Union Carbide understood this problem. Its engineers in West Virginia had designed a MyC storage system with multiple layers of redundancy, refrigeration, scrubbing, flaring, automatic shutoffs, alarms that triggered at pressure thresholds well below the danger point. The system was expensive, and it required constant maintenance, and it had been built because the company's own safety analysis had concluded that a major MIC release could kill thousands of people in the surrounding community. That analysis was conducted for the Institute, West Virginia plant, where the surrounding community was a small town in the Kanawha River Valley, population roughly 10,000. The Bhopal plant was surrounded by a city of roughly 1 million people, many of them living in neighborhoods that pressed directly against the factory walls. The safety report for Bhopal, if it was ever written, has never been made public. The decision to build a mic plant in Bhopal was not an act of malice. It was an act of accounting. The Indian government wanted domestic pesticide production. It wanted to reduce dependence on imports. It wanted the Green Revolution to be Indian, not just American, and it was willing to offer the terms that would make that happen: tax breaks, land concessions, regulatory flexibility, a labor pool that worked for wages that would have been illegal in the United States. Union Carbide wanted to expand its market share in the developing world, and it wanted to manufacture closer to its customers, and it wanted to do both at a cost that would satisfy its shareholders. The two desires met in Bhopal in 1969 when the plant broke ground, and they were sealed in 1977. When the MIC production unit came online, and by the time anyone thought to ask whether the safety systems being installed in Madhya Pradesh were equivalent to the safety systems in West Virginia, the question was already economically inconvenient. The strangest part of the arrangement was not that it happened. It was that everyone involved believed they were doing something good. The Indian agronomists who promoted high-yield varieties believed they were preventing famine. The American scientists who developed Carbaryl believed they were protecting crops from pests that would otherwise destroy them. The Union Carbide executives who approved the Bhopal budget believed they were bringing modern chemistry to a developing nation, and the profits they earned were a fair return on that service. The Indian officials who signed the permits believed they were building an industrial base that would lift their country out of poverty. All of these beliefs were true, in a sense. And all of them were incomplete, in a sense that would become unmistakably clear on a single night in December 1984, when the air in Bhopal turned white, and the people who breathed it began to die. The distance between Punjab and Bhopal is 700 miles. The distance between a backpack sprayer and a 40-ton storage tank is a matter of scale, not chemistry. The molecule in the sprayer and the molecule in the tank were identical. The same 7 atoms, the same arrangement of bonds, the same tendency to seek out water and release heat, and the difference between the farmer who complained of headaches and the factory worker who would die with his lungs full of fluid was only a matter of concentration. In the sprayer, the concentration was measured in parts per million, diluted in water, dispersed by wind. In the tank, the concentration was nearly pure, 40,000 kilograms of liquid MIC waiting under pressure, and when the pressure found its release, the concentration in the air downwind would be measured in parts per thousand, and the dilution would be provided only by the lungs of the people who breathed it. The regulatory conflict was not a secret. It was a feature of the global economic order, written into the trade agreements and investment treaties that governed the movement of capital and the location of factories. Western chemical companies had been relocating hazardous production to developing countries since the 1970s, a phenomenon that economists called comparative advantage and that critics called toxic colonialism. The pattern was consistent. A pesticide banned in the United States would be manufactured for export to Latin America. A solvent too dangerous for European workers would be produced in a plant in India. A chemical intermediate that required expensive containment systems in Germany would be stored in an underground tank in Madhya Pradesh with the refrigeration turned off to save on the electricity bill. The companies knew the risks. The host governments knew the risks, or could have known them if they had asked, but the asking would have meant acknowledging that the bargain they had struck, cheap food in exchange for chemical risk, was a bargain whose terms they had not fully understood. Gurpreet Singh survived the summer of 1983. He survived the summer of 1984 and the summer of 1985. and many summers after that. He died of a heart attack in 2001 at the age of 60, and his death certificate did not mention carbaryl or methyl isocyanate or the Green Revolution or the factory in Bhopal. It said myocardial infarction, which was true, and it said natural causes, which was a matter of perspective. His son, who had taken the photograph, continued to farm the 30 acres, and he continued to use pesticides, and he continued to complain of headaches in the summer. The photograph ended up in a drawer, then in an album, then in a box. The white plastic sprayer was replaced in 1990, then again in 1997, then again in 2005. The molecule did not change. In Bhopal, the tank sat in the ground, and the refrigeration stayed off, and the pressure gauge climbed, and the cost-saving decisions accumulated, like interest in an account whose balance no one was calculating. The chemical that would kill thousands was the same chemical that had protected Gurpreet Singh's wheat from aphids. And the system that had made the wheat possible was the same system that had made the tank possible. And the question that hung in the air, the same air that would soon turn white, was not whether the system was good or evil. It was whether the system had ever been designed to account for the difference between a field and a city, between a backpack sprayer and an underground tank, between a headache and a death. The ward never truly fell silent. Even at 3 in the morning, when the sedatives had pulled most of the patients into shallow, liquid sleep, the sound of breathing filled the long room, a wet, crackling percussion that the doctors had no name for yet. Some lungs whistled on the inhale, a high, thin note that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the chest. Others made a sound like paper crumpling underwater, slow and deliberate, as if the body were negotiating with every breath. The smell of chlorine still clung to the sheets, a leftover from the decontamination station set up in the first panicked hours of December 3, 1984, when the hospitals had become triage points for a war nobody knew they were fighting. Ammonia drifted through the corridors from bottles of household cleaner pressed into service as neutralizing agents. The nurses had stopped noticing the odor weeks ago. It was January 1985. The dead had been counted, buried, burned, and counted again. The living had filled every bed, every corridor, every patch of floor in the hospitals of Bhopal, and the doctors were beginning to realize that they did not know what they were treating. The initial assumption had been clean and terrifying in its simplicity. Methyl isocyanate, or MIC, had escaped from Tank 610 and drifted across the sleeping city. The chemical was known to be volatile, reactive, and acutely toxic. Its mechanism seemed straightforward. MIC reacts with water in the lungs and eyes to produce corrosive acids, essentially burning the respiratory tract from the inside. You treat the burns, you support breathing, and you wait to see who survives. That was the medical logic of December 4 and 5, when the morgues were fuller than the wards, and the lines of bodies outside the hospitals stretched into the streets. But by January, the dead were no longer dying of burns. They were dying of something slower, something that did not match the textbook description of methyl isocyanate poisoning. They were dying with symptoms that suggested a different chemistry entirely. A few doctors began to whisper a new word: cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide is one of the most infamous poisons in the human catalog, a metabolic asphyxiant that prevents cells from using oxygen, killing from the inside out, while the victim gasps for air that is technically abundant but biologically useless. It had not been in Tank 610. The tank had contained methyl isocyanate, a molecule with a different architecture, a different lethal logic. But chemistry is never as stable as the formulas written on safety sheets. Under extreme heat, and the temperature inside tank 610 had climbed past 200 degrees Celsius before the pressure relief valve gave way, molecules do not simply expand, they rearrange. They break apart and recombine into compounds that were not part of the original inventory, that were never listed on any manifest, that exist only in the brief, violent moment of their creation. The researchers who advanced the cyanide hypothesis in the months after the disaster pointed to a chemical pathway that was well understood in laboratories but rarely discussed in the context of industrial accidents. At high temperatures, methyl isocyanate can decompose into hydrogen cyanide, methane, and other small lethal fragments. The intense exothermic reaction that had turned tank 610 into a bomb of boiling liquid may not have simply vaporized the MIC, it may have cooked it into something worse. If cyanide had been present in the cloud that moved across Bhopal on that December night, then some of the people who died in the hours and days after exposure were killed, not by the chemical stored in the tank, but by a byproduct that no safety protocol had anticipated, no evacuation plan had named, and no hospital was prepared to treat. The strange part was not that the idea was controversial. The strange part was how long it took to ask the question at all. The Indian Council of Medical Research, the government body responsible for investigating the health consequences of the disaster, began collecting urine samples from survivors in the weeks after the leak. Urine is a chemical archive, a record of what the body has encountered and tried to eliminate. In the samples from Bhopal, the researchers found elevated levels of thiocyanate, a metabolite that the human body produces when it processes cyanide. Thiocyanate is not normally present in high concentrations in healthy populations. Its presence in the urine of gas survivors suggested that their bodies had been exposed to cyanide, or to something that the body metabolized as if it were cyanide, in quantities significant enough to leave a lasting chemical signature. The finding was not subtle. It was a signal written in the body's own waste products, a testimony that did not require memory or witness statements, only the cold analysis of a laboratory bench. The logical response to this finding was to administer sodium thiosulfate, a well-established antidote for cyanide poisoning that works by providing the body with a sulfadona to accelerate the conversion of cyanide to thiocyanate, flushing the poison out faster. Some doctors in Bhopal began giving sodium thiosulfate to patients in the first weeks after the disaster, and they reported improvement. Patients who had been deteriorating suddenly stabilized, their color returned, their breathing eased. But the treatment was never widely adopted. The Indian Council of Medical Research, after initially acknowledging the thiocyanate findings, reversed its recommendation. Sodium thiosulfate was deemed unnecessary, perhaps even dangerous, in the absence of confirmed cyanide exposure, and the official protocol shifted back to symptomatic treatment of respiratory damage. The ampules of sodium thiosulfate were put back in their boxes. The patients continued to die. Why the treatment was abandoned remains a question that the archive cannot answer with certainty. The decision may have been purely scientific, a lack of definitive proof that cyanide, and not MIC itself, was responsible for the late-stage deaths. It may have been bureaucratic, a reluctance to admit that the initial understanding of the disaster had been incomplete. It may have been influenced by the legal machinery already grinding into motion, the settlement negotiations that would require a clear, stable narrative of cause and effect, a narrative that cyanide complicated in uncomfortable ways. Whatever the reason, the practical result was that a treatment existed, was tried, seen to work, and was discarded. The survivors became the subjects of a natural experiment, observed but not intervened upon, their bodies left to process the poison, whatever the poison was, on their own. The long-term effects of that exposure unfolded over decades, and they did not resemble a single disease. They resembled a library of pathologies, each one apparently linked to the original night, but none following a predictable course. Pulmonary fibrosis set in among survivors who had never smoked, their lungs scarring and stiffening until every breath required conscious effort. The simple act of walking across a room becoming a negotiation with oxygen debt. Immunological disorders appeared. Children who had been downwind of the cloud grew into adults who caught every infection, whose bodies seemed unable to distinguish between a harmless pollen grain and a mortal threat. Neurological damage manifested as memory loss, tremors, cognitive decline that did not match any known degenerative condition. Reproductive complications rippled through the exposed population, higher rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and congenital abnormalities that appeared in children born years after the cloud had dissipated. Cancer rates crept upward, first in studies with small sample sizes and uncertain conclusions, then in larger studies, then in studies so large that the uncertainty collapsed into a grim statistical clarity. The people of the exposed neighborhoods were dying of malignancies at rates that could not be explained by chance or lifestyle. What was killing them? Was it the methyl isocyanate that had settled in their lungs on that December night, initiating a cascade of inflammation and fibrosis that never resolved? Was it the cyanide that may have been present in the cloud, damaging mitochondria and accelerating the cellular aging that leads to cancer? Was it the breakdown products of both chemicals, persistent organic pollutants that lodged in fat and liver and bone marrow, releasing their toxicity in slow drips over a lifetime? Or was it the interaction of all of these? A chemical cocktail that no toxicologist had ever studied, because no ethical researcher would ever design an experiment that exposed human subjects to such a mixture, at such a concentration, in such a way. The archive contains shelves of studies that tried to answer these questions. They fill volumes in medical journals, dissertations in public health programs, reports commissioned by governments and NGOs. Their conclusions are careful, qualified, and contradictory. One study finds a clear dose-response relationship between distance from the plant and pulmonary function decline. Another study, using different statistical methods, finds no such relationship. One researcher identifies a unique pattern of chromosomal damage in exposed populations. Another researcher replicates the study and finds only background rates of chromosomal variation. The science of the disaster is a landscape of disputed terrain, where every finding is shadowed by a counter-finding. Every certainty dissolves under closer examination. And the ground truth, what actually happened inside the bodies of the hundreds of thousands of people who breathed the air that night, remains partially unknown and perhaps unknowable. The chemical analysis of what happened inside Tank 610 is similarly contested. Union Carbide's own scientists, working in the weeks after the disaster, collected samples from the tank's remains, from the soil around the plant, from the residue that coated the pipes and valves. These samples, according to the company, showed no evidence of cyanide or its precursors beyond trace levels that could be explained by background contamination. The company's position was clear. MIC alone was responsible for the deaths, and the decomposition hypothesis was speculative, unsupported by physical evidence. But the company's samples were never independently verified. Some were destroyed in the course of testing. Others were lost in the years that followed, their chain of custody broken, their sealed containers opened or misplaced or simply forgotten. By the time independent researchers requested access to the physical evidence, there was nothing left to examine except the memories of the scientists who had handled the samples, and those memories differed depending on who was asking the questions. This absence of evidence did not prove that cyanide had been present, but it ensured that the question could never be settled. The legal cases against Union Carbide, the civil claims and criminal charges that would grind through Indian and American courts for decades, depended on establishing a clear causal chain. This chemical, released by this company, caused these injuries. The introduction of cyanide into the narrative complicated that chain. It raised the possibility that some of the deaths were caused by a substance that was not explicitly stored, was not explicitly regulated, was not explicitly the responsibility of anyone. It opened a door to doubt, and in a courtroom, doubt is a currency that the defense can spend. The lost samples, the destroyed samples, the samples that were never collected in the first place, these became silences in the legal record, gaps that the archive cannot fill, because the physical world itself has been changed by the processes of investigation and litigation. The evidence was not hidden. It was dissolved, incinerated, neutralized. It was subjected to the same chemistry that it was supposed to explain. The paradox at the heart of the cyanide question is not whether it is true or false. It is that 30 years after the disaster, the question could not be resolved, and that this irresolution is itself a form of evidence. A disaster that killed thousands of people, that injured hundreds of thousands more, that became a global symbol of industrial negligence, occurred through a chemical process that remains only partially understood. The medical literature on methyl isocyanate exposure is based almost entirely on the Bhopal survivors, meaning that the only way to study the long-term effects of the chemical is to study the people who were exposed to it in 1984, a population that is aging, dispersing, dying, and taking its data into the ground. The survivors have become a living laboratory, a cohort of unwilling research subjects in an experiment that no ethics board would ever approve, and the knowledge that can be extracted from them is fading with every year that passes. The hospital ward in January 1985 no longer exists. The building was repurposed, then demolished, then replaced by a newer facility with better equipment and a different name. But the patients who lay in those beds, listening to the sound of their own lungs failing, left a question behind them that has never been fully answered. That question is not simply about which chemical killed them. It is about the relationship between what we know and what we choose to investigate, between the evidence we collect and the evidence we preserve, between the body's testimony and the corporation's record. The cyanide metabolites in the urine of the survivors were a message written in a chemical language that the body cannot falsify. But messages require readers, and readers require access to the text. When the samples are lost, when the treatment is abandoned, when the science is contested by the same parties who were responsible for the safety of the tank, the message becomes unreadable. It becomes a ghost in the archive, a presence that can be felt but not documented, a suspicion that the dead knew something the living have chosen to forget. The archive stores this uncertainty not as a failure but as a persistence. The ledgers remain open, the empty sample vials still arranged on a shelf in a laboratory that exists only in memory, the sound of breathing still audible in the dark spaces between the pages. The cyanide question is not a mystery that waits for a detective. It is a condition of the disaster itself, a permanent ambiguity that marks the limit of what forensic science can reconstruct when the physical evidence has been allowed to disappear. The cloud that rose from Tank 610 carried not just chemicals, but also consequences that outran the instruments designed to measure them. The body keeps its own books, but those books are written in a language that requires translation, and the translator has left the room. The courtroom in Bhopal smelled of old paper and sweat, and the faint medicinal sharpness of eucalyptus oil that survivors rubbed on their chests before entering, hoping to quiet the cough that never really stopped. The benches were hard, polished by years of bodies shifting through hearings that always seemed to reach the same dead end before lunch. In the back rows, a woman pressed a folded handkerchief to her mouth, not for tears, but for the fluid her lungs kept producing, a thin, persistent leakage that doctors had learned to expect in patients who had inhaled methyl isocyanate a decade earlier and never fully healed. Her name was on a list somewhere, numbered among the hundreds of thousands who had filed claims. But on that particular morning, the morning the lawyers began arguing about statutes of limitations, her name was just a case file, a file that the court was considering closing forever. The settlement had already been signed. That was the strange part. The disaster itself had lasted perhaps 2 hours on the night of December 3, 1984. But the legal machinery that followed ground forward for only 2 years before the Indian government, acting on behalf of all victims, accepted a payment of $470 million from Union Carbide to extinguish every civil claim arising from the gas leak. The figure was announced in 1986 as a triumph of negotiation, a swift resolution that would spare families the agony of protracted litigation and deliver compensation directly into the hands of those who needed it most. But the arithmetic, when you sat down with the numbers, told a different story. 400,000 people had registered as claimants, which meant that even if the entire settlement had been distributed evenly, each person would receive less than $500. In the end, the distribution was not even. By the time the payments were completed between 1989 and 1992, only 350,000 of the original claimants received any compensation at all, and the average payout worked out to roughly $550 per person, a sum that, spread across years of legal delays and administrative friction, could not cover a single year of the ongoing medical treatment that most survivors required for the rest of their lives. The company had insured the Bhopal plant for $500 million. That detail, buried in insurance filings and corporate disclosures, illuminated the mathematics more starkly than any courtroom testimony. The $470 million settlement was almost exactly the maximum amount that Union Carbide's insurance policy would pay, a coincidence so neat that it suggested less a negotiation over the value of human life than a calculation about the limits of corporate exposure. The company's own cash reserves, its assets, its shareholder value, all of it remained untouched beyond what the policy covered. In effect, Union Carbide had purchased a $500 million policy against the risk of catastrophic failure. The disaster had occurred, the insurance had paid out nearly to the cap, and the corporation itself walked away with its balance sheet fundamentally unbruised. It was, in the ledger books of a multinational chemical conglomerate, a resolved liability, a closed file, a tax write-off, in fact, which the company later claimed under United States law, turning the deaths of thousands into a deduction against American corporate income. The courtroom in 1992 still had to wrestle with the criminal case, which had not been settled by that check. Warren Anderson, the chairman and CEO of Union Carbide at the time of the disaster, had been charged in India with culpable homicide, a crime that, had he been convicted, carried a sentence of up to 10 years in prison. He had traveled to Bhopal shortly after the leak, been briefly detained by Indian authorities, and then released on bail. He returned to the United States and never went back. The Indian government requested his extradition. The United States government declined to enforce the request, citing procedural deficiencies in the paperwork, the absence of a mutual extradition treaty covering the specific charges, and the quiet, durable immunity that American corporate executives have historically enjoyed when their decisions harm people in other countries. Anderson lived the rest of his life in comfort in Florida and New York, and died in 2014 at the age of 92. Having never testified in an Indian courtroom, never faced cross-examination, never been compelled to explain under oath the decisions that had disabled the safety systems on Tank 610. So the legal process in Bhopal narrowed its focus onto the lower-level Indian managers, the operators, the engineers who had been on the ground that night when the pressure gauge climbed into the red zone and the scrubber failed to activate. These men were charged, tried, and eventually convicted, not of mass murder, not of corporate negligence, but of a lesser offense that carried a sentence of 2 years in prison. They served less than that. The corporation itself, the entity that had designed the plant, that had approved the stripped-down safety configuration, that had resisted investing in repairs even as its own inspectors warned of contamination risks, was never put in the dock as a criminal defendant. The legal structure of limited liability, which had been invented in the 19th century to encourage industrial investment by shielding shareholders from personal financial ruin, had evolved into a mechanism that could also shield a corporation from the full weight of its own catastrophic choices. The people on the wooden benches in the Bhopal courtroom in 1992 listened to the lawyers argue over whether the statute of limitations had expired for the remaining claims, and many of them did not understand the Latin phrases or the procedural technicalities. They understood only that they had been breathing with difficulty for 8 years, that their children, born long after the gas cloud had dissipated, still woke up coughing in the dark, and that the legal system seemed to be constructing ever more elaborate doorways through which nobody would actually walk to face them. Outside the courthouse, the children who had been born after December 1984 ran through the streets with the same diminished lung capacity that their parents had acquired on a single night. A generational inheritance of inflammation and scar tissue that the settlement had not accounted for, because no one had yet proven that the damage could cross the placental barrier. Later research would suggest it did, but by then the appellate windows had closed. The $550 average payout, when it finally reached a family, usually arrived after years of delay, after the submission of medical records that many families could not afford to produce, after the death of the primary wage earner, after the sale of whatever small assets they had once owned. The money paid for a few months of medicine, or a new roof, or a daughter's wedding that had been postponed, and then it was gone. The chronic conditions required continuous treatment, but the compensation was one-time and final, a contractual extinguishment of all future claims, signed not by the victims themselves but by the Indian government on their behalf. The government had reasoned that a swift settlement was better than decades of litigation that the victims might not survive to see resolved. It was a genuine attempt to bring relief, but it also closed the door on any future legal accountability for the corporation that had manufactured the danger. That door closing would prove to be the deeper legacy of the Bhopal litigation. The settlement became a precedent, cited in international business law seminars and corporate boardrooms for decades afterward. It demonstrated that a company could operate a hazardous facility in a developing country with safety standards far below what it maintained at its equivalent plant in the United States, and if the worst happened, the financial penalty could be absorbed by an insurance policy while the responsible executives remained beyond the reach of foreign courts. The message was not written down in any treaty. It was simply read in the pattern of outcomes, a pattern that multinational corporations understood without needing to be told. When a subsequent chemical disaster occurred in another country, the lawyers would invoke Bhopal as the benchmark for what a settlement could look like, and the number would be low, and the question of criminal accountability would remain suspended in the jurisdictional gap between nations. But the question that Bhopal raised was not just a legal one. It was a moral question about the structure of global industry itself. When a company knows that its foreign plant is operating below Western safety standards and people die as a result, is that an industrial accident or a decision to accept a death rate that would be illegal at home? The difference matters because an accident implies unforeseeability, a sudden breakdown of systems that no reasonable person could have predicted. But the Bhopal plant had a documented history of leaks, a 1982 safety audit that identified more than 20 serious hazards, and a corporate management that had selected a cheaper, less robust safety configuration for the Indian facility, the same management that later approved a West Virginia plant with redundant scrubbers, automated alarms, and refrigerated storage that worked. The decisions were made with knowledge of the risks, and the risks materialized exactly as the company's own engineers had warned they could. The courtroom in 1992, and the larger legal architecture that surrounded it, never truly engaged with that question. The law is a narrow instrument. It asks whether a specific statute was violated, whether a duty of care was breached, whether the evidence meets a particular standard of proof. It is not designed to interrogate the deeper structure of a global economic system that permits the externalization of risk onto the bodies of people who cannot afford to move away from the factory fence. The silence in the Bhopal courtroom was not just the absence of Warren Anderson or the absence of a corporate criminal conviction. It was the silence of a legal framework that had no vocabulary for the thing that had actually happened. After the settlement was paid, after the criminal appeals were exhausted, after the international human rights organizations had published their reports calling the outcome a miscarriage of justice, the factory site itself remained, and the groundwater beneath it, which had been soaking up chemical residues for years, began to reveal its own long-term testimony, a testimony that no courtroom would ever fully hear. The story of Bhopal had moved from the air to the courts, and now it was moving from the courts to the soil and the water, where the evidence would persist long after the last legal file was archived. The woman with the folded handkerchief left the courtroom that afternoon and walked back to her neighborhood, where the water from the public tap carried a faint chemical tang that everyone had learned to ignore. Her compensation had arrived 6 years earlier and had already been spent. Her daughter, born in 1986, was now coughing in the same way she had coughed since December 3, 1984. The lawyers had finished arguing, and the judge had reserved his decision, which meant another 6 months of waiting, another season of hoping that the statute of limitations would not apply to a body that still generated fresh symptoms every morning. The legal question was about time limits. The biological question had no time limit at all. It simply continued, cell by cell, generation by generation, a slow, unadjudicated unfolding that the settlement had purchased, the right to ignore. You can trace the disaster downward. Not through the lungs anymore. That story has been told and told again, until the words have worn smooth as river stones, but through the soil, through the layer of gray clay beneath the concrete foundations of the old plant, through the water table that sits 30 feet below the surface and moves slowly in the direction of the city, through the wells that were dug by hand in the years after the cloud lifted, when families who had fled returned to homes they could not afford to abandon, and found that the land they had left behind had changed in ways they could not see and would not understand for decades. The first groundwater samples were collected in 1986. The results arrived in a laboratory report that circulated through government offices in Bhopal and New Delhi, then quietly disappeared into a filing cabinet. The numbers were not ambiguous. Mercury concentrations at 12 times the World Health Organization's maximum permissible limit for drinking water. Lead at 8 times the safety threshold. Chlorinated hydrocarbons, the family of solvents that includes carbon tetrachloride and chloroform, at levels that made the water technically classifiable as hazardous waste, not drinking water, not irrigation water, not water that any human being should touch. But the wells were still there, and the people who drank from them had nowhere else to go. The strange part was not that the groundwater was poisoned. The strange part was that anyone expected it to be clean. The Union Carbide plant had operated for 15 years before the disaster, and in those years, the disposal of chemical waste followed a protocol that was less a protocol than an absence. Spent solvents were poured into evaporation pits behind the storage buildings. Residues from the reaction vessels were washed into unlined trenches. Broken drums of intermediates and byproducts were stacked in a yard and left to rust. When the monsoon came each summer, the rain fell on those drums and pits and trenches, and the water carried whatever it dissolved downward. The plant was built on soil that had never been properly sealed against this kind of leaching. The concrete pad beneath the MIC storage tanks was designed to hold the weight of the vessels, not to prevent chemical migration. Beneath the pad was clay. Beneath the clay was fractured basalt. Beneath the basalt was an aquifer that supplied water to the same neighborhoods whose residents had breathed the gas. The geology connected everything, and it connected everything downhill. By the time the plant was abandoned in the weeks after the disaster, the contamination of the ground beneath it was already irreversible. The question was how far it had spread and how fast and into whose bodies. The woman's name was Hasina B, and in the photographs taken of her in 2010, she looks older than her 46 years. She lived in the Chola neighborhood, in a house her father had built in the 1960s, before the plant arrived, when the land was still agricultural, and the water in the well was sweet enough to drink without boiling. After the disaster, she and her family stayed. They had no money to leave. Her husband found work in a textile mill on the other side of the city, and she raised 4 children in the house where she had been raised. And every morning she walked 2 miles to the public water tap near the railway station, because the well in her yard had been declared undrinkable in 1994. The water from the public tap was supposed to be safe. It came from a municipal supply that drew from a different aquifer, deeper and better protected. But Hasina B told the journalist who interviewed her that the water left a metallic taste in her mouth, and that her stomach burned after she drank it, and that she had learned to ignore both sensations because ignoring them was easier than thinking about what they meant. Her children had the same complaints. Her youngest daughter, born in 1987, suffered from chronic diarrhea and skin rashes that came and went without explanation. The doctors at the government clinic prescribed antibiotics when they could, and when they could not, they prescribed patience. The journalist asked Hasina B if she knew what was in the water. She said she did not want to know. The knowing, she said, would not change the drinking. The report that the journalist was following had been published 8 years earlier, in 2002, by the environmental organization Greenpeace. Its authors had collected groundwater samples from 22 locations within a 3-mile radius of the former plant. They had analyzed the samples for heavy metals, for volatile organic compounds, for the breakdown products of methyl isocyanate and its associated intermediates. The findings filled a document that ran to more than 100 pages, and the document's conclusions were written in the careful, measured language of scientific reportage, and the language made the conclusions worse. Benzene, carbon tetrachloride, chloroform, hexachlorobenzene, 1,2-dichloroethane. The names read like an inventory of a chemical warehouse, and each name corresponded to a substance known to cause cancer in humans. The concentrations exceeded international safety standards by factors that ranged from 10 to more than 600. At one sampling point, near a well that served approximately 4,000 people, the benzene concentration was measured at 2.5 parts per million, 250 times the World Health Organization guideline of 10 parts per billion. Benzene attacks the bone marrow. It interferes with the production of blood cells. Chronic exposure causes leukemia, aplastic anemia, the slow collapse of the body's ability to manufacture its own life. The people drinking from that well were not being poisoned in the way their parents had been poisoned on the night the air turned chemical. They were being poisoned differently, more slowly, with less visible horror, but with a certainty that was, in its own way, just as complete. The Greenpeace report concluded that the contamination posed a serious and immediate threat to the health of approximately 200,000 people. The phrase was chosen carefully. Serious meant that the risk was not hypothetical. Immediate meant that the exposure was happening now, to people who were already drinking the water, cooking with the water, bathing in the water, giving the water to their children. The report was published in newspapers, discussed in Parliament, cited in legal briefs. Then the discussion faded, and the briefs stalled, and the water kept moving through the aquifer at the same slow rate it had always moved, carrying the same molecules it had been carrying since the years when the plant was still manufacturing the insecticide that was supposed to protect crops. The insecticide. That was the paradox that the report could not resolve. The Bhopal plant had been built to produce carbaryl, a molecule designed to kill pests that threatened crops. The logic of its existence was agricultural protection, the safeguarding of food, the reduction of hunger, the chemical defense of living things. And yet the same facility that had been built to protect life from pests had poisoned the soil so thoroughly that nothing would grow on the site for decades. The irony was not subtle, it was geological. In 2004, the Indian government announced a plan to remove the waste from the former plant and transport it to a secure disposal facility. The plan identified approximately 350 metric tons of contaminated material, spent catalysts, reactor residues, drums of unidentified solvents, soil that had absorbed decades of spills and leaching. The plan estimated the cost of removal at 200 million rupees. The plan was approved by the relevant ministries and scheduled to begin within the year. By 2006, the waste had not been moved. Legal challenges had been filed by the state government of Madhya Pradesh, which objected to the cost-sharing arrangement. Political disputes had arisen over which disposal facility would accept the material, and whether that facility was adequately designed to contain it. Environmental activists had argued that transporting the waste through populated areas would create a risk of accidental release. The arguments continued for 2 years, then 3, then 5. The waste remained where it was, exposed to the monsoon rains, the summer heat, the slow passage of seasons. A photograph taken in 2018 shows the site as it had become. The concrete foundations of the MIC storage tanks are still visible, gray rectangles half buried in weeds. The rusted remains of the flare tower rise from the ground like the skeleton of some industrial animal. Broken glass from shattered windows and discarded laboratory equipment glitters in the sunlight. And in the distance, beyond the chain-link fence that surrounds the property, the lights of Bhopal are coming on. 2 million people, many of whom live within sight of the plant. All of them breathing the same air, and some of them still drinking the same water that the Greenpeace report had identified as hazardous 16 years earlier. In 2014, the Supreme Court of India issued an order. The state government of Madhya Pradesh was directed to provide clean drinking water to the communities surrounding the former plant. The court acknowledged that the contamination was irreversible, that the chemicals in the aquifer could not be removed, only managed, only avoided, only worked around. The order was a legal acknowledgement of a physical fact that had been true for 30 years. The water was poisoned. The poison would not go away. The only remaining question was whether the people who drank the water would be given something else to drink. The order was not fully implemented. The reasons were the usual reasons: funding disagreements, bureaucratic delays, the sheer logistical difficulty of running municipal water lines through neighborhoods that had grown up organically around the plant over decades without planning. Without formal street grids, without the infrastructure that made infrastructure possible, some communities received new wells, some received pipelines, some received nothing at all. By 2024, more than a decade after the Supreme Court's ruling, many families in the neighborhoods of Chola and JP Nagar still relied on water from hand pumps and shallow wells that drew from the same aquifer the court had declared contaminated. The water that came from those wells was the ghost of the cloud. The molecules were different compounds, different toxicities, different mechanisms of harm, but the origin was the same tank, the same plant. The same chemical process that had turned methyl isocyanate from an industrial intermediate into a weapon. The cloud had dissipated in a matter of hours, dispersing over the city and eventually breaking down into compounds that could no longer be detected in the air. But what the cloud had left behind, leaking downward through concrete and clay and basalt, was a slower kind of disaster, one that moved at the speed of groundwater, which is to say the speed of geology, which is to say a speed that human institutions are not designed to match. The archive of the Bhopal disaster contains many documents: court transcripts, medical records, safety inspection reports, photographs of the dead, photographs of the living. But the document that best captures the nature of what happened beneath the plant is not a document at all. It is a sample of water drawn from a well and sealed in a glass vial and stored in a laboratory refrigerator, waiting for an analysis that has already been performed and that produced results that have already been read and filed and forgotten. The water in the vial is clear. It has no odor. It looks exactly like water should look. And if you were to drink it, the damage would not appear for years, until the benzene had done its work on your bone marrow, until the lead had accumulated in your nervous system, until the chlorinated hydrocarbons had passed through your liver and left behind cells that had forgotten how to stop dividing. This is the way the ground beneath Bhopal keeps its own records, not in words but in concentrations, not in verdicts but in half-lives. The chemicals will outlast the court orders. They will outlast the governments that issued them, and the journalists who reported on them, and the lawyers who argued about them. They have already outlasted the company that put them there. Union Carbide was acquired by Dow Chemical in 2001, and its name exists now only as a legal entity, a defendant in cases that will never be fully resolved, a signature on a settlement check that was cashed decades ago. The ground does not care about any of this. The ground absorbs what is poured onto it and holds it and releases it slowly into the water that moves beneath the surface, and the water carries it to the wells where people drink, and the people carry it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The process is physical, not moral. It has no interest in justice. It has no mechanism for accountability. It simply continues at the same rate year after year, while the institutions that were supposed to protect the people who live on that ground argue about funding and jurisdiction and whether the contamination is really as bad as the reports say it is. The woman from Chola, Hasina B., died in 2017. The cause of death was recorded as renal failure. Her daughter, the one born in 1987, still lives in the same house and still walks to the same public tap and still sometimes feels a burning sensation in her stomach after she drinks. She has a daughter of her own now. The child was born in 2014, the same year the Supreme Court issued its order, and she has never known any water but the water her mother brings from the tap. The burning, her mother tells her, is nothing, a little irritation, nothing to worry about. The same words that were spoken in a lunchroom in 1983, when the workers at the plant told each other stories about the way the wind from the wrong direction made their eyes sting, and the supervisors told them it was fine. The words have outlasted the plant. They have outlasted the cloud. They have outlasted every safety inspection and every government order and every promise of remediation. They are still being spoken in the same neighborhoods by mothers to daughters in the language of a disaster that was supposed to have ended 40 years ago, but that never really ended at all. The control room at Institute, West Virginia, still smelled of fresh paint in the autumn of 1986. The company had spent 2 years renovating the safety systems after Bhopal, installing new alarms, new scrubbers, new backup refrigeration units that hummed in the background like a promise kept. On the wall, a framed chart showed the correct procedure for isolating a runaway methyl isocyanate tank, each step numbered and laminated against the chemical air. The operators who worked the midnight shift had been retrained, recertified, and reminded that this plant was the model, the proof that an American facility could handle the same molecule that had killed thousands on the other side of the world. At 11 o'clock on a Sunday night in August, a pressure gauge on a storage tank began to climb. The operator on duty noticed it immediately because he had been trained to notice, and because the memory of Bhopal had turned every gauge into a small, insistent conscience. He radioed his supervisor, who checked the logbooks and saw that a transfer line had been flushed with water earlier in the shift, and that the valve between the water line and the MIC line had been left open for exactly 47 seconds longer than the procedure allowed. The water had already entered the tank. The exothermic reaction had already begun. What happened next was a matter of record. The scrubber engaged, but its caustic concentration was lower than the specifications required, because the testing schedule had been reduced to save maintenance hours. The flare tower ignited, but its flame was too small to destroy the full volume of gas that boiled out of the pressure relief valve. By midnight, a cloud of MIC had risen above the Kanawha River Valley and begun to drift toward the residential neighborhoods of Institute, where 135 people would be hospitalized with burning lungs and swollen eyes before the morning shift arrived to find the plant shut down and the investigation already underway. Nobody died at Institute. That fact would be repeated for years in boardrooms and congressional hearings and shareholder reports as evidence that the American system worked, that the safety investments had paid off, that Bhopal could not happen here. But the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the agency created in 1985 precisely because Congress had looked at Bhopal and seen a mirror, found a different story buried in the instruments and the logbooks and the testimony of the workers who had been inside the control room when the alarm sounded. The board's report, issued in early 1987, ran to more than 200 pages, and its central finding was that the Institute release had the same root causes as Bhopal: inadequate training on the specific hazards of the chemical, poor communication between shifts about the status of safety equipment, and a culture that rewarded cost-cutting as reliably as it punished whistleblowers. The paint on the walls was new, but the operating logic beneath it was old, and it had not changed enough to prevent a near disaster at the very plant that was supposed to prove the company had learned its lesson. The strange part was not that the accident happened, but that the company's own internal memos had predicted it. In the months before the release, plant engineers had filed 3 separate requests to repair the caustic concentration monitor, and all 3 had been deferred. The deferred maintenance list, when the investigators subpoenaed it, showed a pattern that any safety auditor would recognize. The most expensive repairs had been postponed longest, and the equipment that protected human life was consistently rated lower in priority than the equipment that protected production schedules. The ledger told the story before the gas did. The Chemical Safety Board had been given a clear mandate when it was founded: investigate every significant chemical accident on American soil, determine the root cause, and issue recommendations to prevent recurrence. But Congress had given the board only the power to speak, not the power to compel. Its recommendations were advisory. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration could issue fines. The Environmental Protection Agency could revoke permits, but the board itself could only publish reports and hope that someone in authority would read them before the next tank overheated. This distinction mattered because the board's 1987 report on Institute contained 17 specific recommendations for Union Carbide, and the company implemented 11 of them. The remaining 6, including the recommendation to install independent, redundant temperature monitors that could not be bypassed by the control room operators, were deemed too costly, and Union Carbide's lawyers successfully argued that the recommendations were not legally binding, and therefore the company was not required to adopt them. The missing monitors would have added approximately $2.14 to the cost of each ton of methyl isocyanate produced at Institute, according to the board's own estimate. The company decided against the expense. In the years that followed, the United States would pass the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which required chemical plants to develop risk management programs that identified their worst-case release scenarios and made those scenarios available to the public. It was hailed as the most aggressive chemical safety legislation in the world, and in many ways, it was. For the first time, communities near chemical plants could walk into a public library and read a document that said, plainly, what might happen if the storage tank across the street failed. The law required plants to simulate their own disasters and publish the results, and it required them to explain what they were doing to prevent those simulations from becoming real. The paradox was embedded in the law's jurisdiction. The Clean Air Act covered facilities inside the United States. It did not cover facilities in India, or Mexico, or Indonesia, or Brazil, or any of the other nations where American chemical companies operated subsidiary plants that manufactured the same molecules using the same processes under regulatory frameworks that were, by design, far less stringent. The companies were not violating the law by shifting their most dangerous production to countries with weaker enforcement. They were simply following the economic logic that the law itself had created. An MIC plant in Louisiana had to comply with the risk management program and submit to EPA inspections and keep its safety records available for public review. An MIC plant in Madhya Pradesh had to comply with local regulations that were, in many cases, a fraction as demanding, and the American law had nothing to say about it. The legal boundary turned into a chemical boundary. The same molecule could be manufactured under two different standards of care, and the only difference was the latitude at which the factory had been built. In 1991, at a Union Carbide facility in Texas, plant operators drilled for a Bhopal-style emergency. The drill scenario assumed a water contamination event identical to the one that had triggered the Institute release, and the operators practiced isolating the leaking tank, donning protective suits, and activating the emergency scrubber within a 4-minute window. The drill was recorded on videotape and later used as a training tool for other facilities. The operators performed well. The scrubber engaged. The simulated cloud never left the simulated pipe. In the same year, at a Union Carbide facility in Argentina, a tank of phosgene gas, a chemical used in the production of agricultural intermediates and considerably more lethal than MIC, developed a leak during a routine maintenance operation. The phosgene cloud injured 12 workers, 2 of them critically, before the leak was contained. The investigation found that the local plant manager had never seen the Texas training video, that the emergency procedures had not been updated in 6 years, and that the scrubber designed to neutralize phosgene releases had been shut down for repair and never restarted. The report on the Argentina release was filed in a corporate archive and never made public, and the workers who were injured received compensation packages that included confidentiality clauses, preventing them from speaking to journalists about the conditions they had experienced. The pattern was not difficult to discern. The same company that trained its American workers to drill for a disaster was operating plants on other continents that lacked the equipment to withstand the same event. The training was portable, but the safety infrastructure was not. The drills were practiced where the liability was highest. The drills were forgotten where the liability was cheaper. The global production of methyl isocyanate never stopped. After Bhopal, many chemical companies that used MIC in pesticide synthesis redesigned their processes to generate the molecule on demand rather than storing it in large quantities, a reform that was genuinely significant and that almost certainly prevented additional large-scale releases. But the redesign did not eliminate MIC from the supply chain. It simply changed where the molecule was held, and for how long, and by whom. A tank that once held 40 metric tons of liquid MIC might now hold 4, or 1, or none at all. But the railroad cars and the shipping containers and the intermediate storage vessels that moved the chemical between factories still carried enough to fill a neighborhood with gas if a valve failed or a water line crossed. The question that Bhopal raised in 1984 was the same question that Institute raised in 1986, that Texas drilled for in 1991, that Argentina suffered in the same year, and that every chemical plant in the world still answers every day with its maintenance budget and its staffing levels and its decisions about which repairs can wait until the next quarter. The question is not whether the chemical industry can operate safely, because it demonstrably can for years at a time without incident. The question is whether the entire global system, the factories in India and the factories in Louisiana, the supply chains that crisscross oceans, the corporate structures that insulate decision makers from the consequences of their decisions, and the regulatory frameworks that stop at national borders can ever be made safe enough that the communities living nearest to the tanks can trust that the air they breathe at night will be the same air they breathed in the morning. The archive contains thousands of pages of testimony from survivors of Bhopal, from chemical engineers who designed the safety systems that failed, from executives who approved the budgets that disabled them, from government officials who balanced the promise of agricultural productivity against the risk of industrial catastrophe. The pages are consistent in one respect only. No one described themselves as the person who made the decision. The decisions were made by committees, or by cost-benefit analyses, or by standard operating procedures, or by the inexorable pressure of quarterly earnings targets. The decisions were distributed so widely that no single signature appeared at the bottom of the page, and that distribution made the decisions impossible to prosecute and almost impossible to remember. In 2023, a chemical plant in the United States received a shipment of methyl isocyanate from a rail car that had traveled across 3 states. The shipment was logged in a digital inventory system, and the tank was pressurized and cooled and monitored by sensors that fed data to a control room where an operator watched a screen that displayed the temperature inside the tank to 1 decimal place of precision. The safety systems were modern, automated, and redundant. The operator had been trained on the hazards of MIC and on the evacuation procedures, and she had signed a document confirming that she understood them. The plant had filed its risk management plan with the EPA, and the plan was available for public review at the county library, where a citizen could walk in and read it if they knew it existed and knew where to look. The air that night was clear, and the temperature gauge held steady at 0 degrees Celsius, and the scrubber was fully charged with caustic soda, and the flare tower was lit, and nothing happened. Nothing happened at that plant, or at any of the other plants in the industrialized world that handled the same chemical without incident. The system worked, and the only evidence of its working was the absence of a cloud, the silence of the alarms, the ordinary breathing of the people who lived downwind. But the bill that Bhopal presented has never been fully paid. The chemical is still there, in the tanks and the pipelines and the shipping manifests, and the question that the archive leaves open is not whether the next disaster will happen, but where, and under whose jurisdiction, and whether the people who might be harmed have been told what they are living next to, and whether the company that owns the tank has set aside enough money to cover the cost of a single night when every safeguard fails at once. The drills continue, and the reports are filed, and the molecule remains what it has always been, a small, volatile, colorless liquid that boils at the temperature of a human body and waits for the water to find its way in. The machine that measures breath in Bhopal is the same machine that measures breath in Boston, in Berlin, in Buenos Aires. It is called a spirometer, and it asks nothing of the patient except that she inhale as deeply as she can and then exhale into a plastic tube until her lungs are empty. The machine prints a graph, a curve that rises, peaks, and falls, tracing the shape of a single breath reduced to ink and arithmetic. In most cities, the graph tells a story that the patient already knows: asthma, age, smoking, recovery. In Bhopal, the graph tells a story that began before the patient was born, and the doctor reading it has seen the same curve so many times that it has acquired the quality of a signature written by someone who never signed anything. The clinic sits in the J.P. Nagar neighborhood, less than a mile from the abandoned Union Carbide plant. It is 2023. A woman born in 1985, born 8 months after the cloud passed through her mother's lungs, has brought her own daughter for respiratory testing. The girl is 12 years old. She has never lived anywhere but Bhopal. She has never breathed any air but this air. The doctor notes that her lung function is below normal for her age, that her peak expiratory flow rate is reduced, that the curve on the spirometer printout looks like a smaller, flatter version of the curve the machine produced when her mother was tested at the same age. The doctor writes something in the margin of the file. The pattern is so common in this neighborhood that it has ceased to be remarkable, and that lack of remarkability is, in its own way, the most remarkable thing about it. The official death toll from the Bhopal disaster has never been agreed upon, and the disagreement is not a matter of rounding error or incomplete record keeping. It is a disagreement about what counts as a death from the gas. The Indian government initially reported 2,259 deaths. That number included only the bodies that were collected, identified, and recorded in the first days after December 3, 1984. The bodies that died visibly, quickly, and close enough to a hospital that someone could write down a name. Amnesty International estimated 8,000 deaths within the first 2 weeks, counting the bodies that were buried in mass graves before they could be counted, the bodies that were cremated by families who could not afford to wait for paperwork. The bodies that died in railway stations and on roadsides and in the back of trucks that were supposed to be ambulances. Survivor organizations claim that between 15,000 and 25,000 people have died over the decades from gas-related illnesses and complications, the slow deaths. The deaths that came years later from lungs that never healed, from cancers that began in scarred tissue, from immune systems that collapsed without warning, from hearts that gave out under the strain of breathing through permanently damaged airways. The gap between 2,259 and 25,000 is not a statistical dispute. It is a map of what happens when a disaster does not end on the night it begins. The medical literature on methyl isocyanate exposure is based almost entirely on the Bhopal disaster. Before December 1984, almost nothing was known about what MIC does to the human body over time because almost no one had ever been exposed to it in concentrations high enough to study. The chemical's toxicity had been tested on laboratory animals, rats, guinea pigs, rabbits, and the results had suggested that MIC was an irritant, a respiratory hazard, something to be handled with care but not something that would produce a unique clinical syndrome. The animal studies did not predict what happened in Bhopal, because the animal studies did not expose their subjects to a cloud of concentrated MIC gas in the middle of the night, did not follow the survivors for 40 years, did not examine the children of the exposed. The only way to study the long-term effects of the chemical is to study the survivors themselves, And that has turned the population of Bhopal into something that no ethics committee would ever approve. A living laboratory for a toxicological experiment that was never designed, never consented to, and never declared complete. The researchers came within months of the disaster. They came from Indian medical institutes and from international health organizations and from universities that wanted to understand what had happened to the lungs of Bhopal. They took blood samples and urine samples and chest x-rays. They asked questions about coughing and breathlessness and the burning sensation that many survivors still felt in their eyes when the wind came from the direction of the abandoned plant. They published papers in epidemiology journals with titles like Long-Term Pulmonary Sequela of Methyl, Isocyanate Exposure, and Immunological Abnormalities in Gas, Exposed Populations in Bhopal. The papers were careful and rigorous and filled with data, and they became the foundation of an entire field of medical knowledge that should never have needed to exist. A 2009 study by the Indian government's National Institute of Occupational Health brought the numbers into clinical focus. The study examined survivors in the most heavily exposed areas and found that their pulmonary function levels were 30 to 50% lower than normal. 30 to 50%. That is the difference between walking up a flight of stairs and pausing to catch your breath. It is the difference between carrying a child and being unable to lift your arms above your head. It is the difference between sleeping through the night and waking at 3:00 a.m. with a cough that feels like something is tearing inside your chest. The study documented persistent respiratory infections that never fully cleared, chronic bronchitis that became the background noise of daily life, and a condition that the researchers named Bhopal lung disease, a clinical syndrome that had no equivalent in medical literature before the disaster, because no population had ever been exposed to anything quite like this before. Bhopal lung disease is characterized by progressive fibrosis of the small airways, by a pattern of scarring that the body cannot repair, by a slow, permanent reduction in the ability to move air in and out of the lungs. It does not kill quickly. It kills gradually, over decades, and the cause of death is often listed as pneumonia, or respiratory failure, or cardiac arrest, and the word Bhopal does not appear on the death certificate at all. The children complicate the story in ways that the lung studies alone cannot explain. Children born to parents who were exposed to the gas that night have been found to have elevated rates of intellectual disability, learning disorders, and physical deformities. The studies are cautious about causation. It is difficult to separate the effects of chemical exposure from the effects of poverty, malnutrition, inadequate medical care, and the other burdens that fall on communities living in the shadow of an industrial disaster. But the patterns are too consistent to dismiss. A child whose mother breathed MIC while pregnant is more likely to have a smaller head circumference at birth. A child whose father worked at the plant is more likely to struggle with reading and memory. A child whose grandparents still live in the neighborhood downwind of the abandoned factory is more likely to be born with a heart defect, or a cleft palate, or a neurological condition that has no name. The suggestion, and it is still only a suggestion, because the science of transgenerational chemical exposure is new and difficult and politically fraught, is that MIC may have caused genetic damage that can be passed from parent to child. That the cloud of 1984 did not just poison the people who breathed it, but may have altered something in the germline that continues to express itself in bodies that were not yet conceived when the pressure gauge on tank 610 crossed the red line. The woman in the clinic in 2023, the one with the daughter whose lung function is below normal, was part of a cohort study that began before she was born. Her mother was enrolled in a health survey in 1985, one of thousands of survivors who agreed to be examined and questioned and sampled in the hope that the data would lead to better treatment. The mother coughed during the interview. The interviewer noted it. The daughter was born later that year, and she was enrolled in a follow-up study when she was 6 months old, and then again at 5 years, and then again at 12, and then again as an adult, and now her own daughter is being tested. And the machine prints out a curve that looks like the curve her mother produced, and the curve she produced, and the curve that thousands of other people in this neighborhood have produced. And the data accumulates in files that are stored in a government archive that is underfunded and understaffed and occasionally flooded during the monsoon season. And the researchers keep publishing papers, and the papers keep saying that the survivors of Bhopal are sicker than they should be. And nothing about that statement has changed in 39 years. The paradox at the center of this archive is not subtle. The only comprehensive knowledge humanity possesses about the long-term effects of methyl isocyanate on human populations was purchased by the suffering of 400,000 people who did not consent to the experiment. Every paper published in a peer-reviewed journal, every textbook chapter on chemical toxicology, every pulmonary specialist who can recognize the characteristic fibrosis pattern of Bhopal lung disease on a chest X-ray, all of it rests on a foundation of exposure that was never supposed to happen and that no ethical review board would have permitted if someone had proposed it as a study design. The survivors have become, in the language of the medical literature, a valuable cohort for understanding the natural history of acute MIC exposure. The language is not cruel. It is the ordinary language of epidemiology, the same language that describes any population of people who share a common exposure and whose health outcomes can be tracked over time. But the word natural in that sentence is doing work it should not be asked to do. There was nothing natural about the night the air turned chemical, and the history it produced is not a natural history. It is an unnatural history, a history of decisions and omissions and calculations made in boardrooms far from Bhopal, and the people whose bodies became the data set did not volunteer for the role. The Bhopal disaster is often described in textbooks and documentaries and anniversary news reports as the worst industrial accident in history. The description is almost universally accepted, and it is almost universally misleading. An accident is an unforeseeable event, a random intersection of circumstances that could not have been predicted or prevented. What happened in Bhopal was not unforeseeable. The company's own safety inspectors had predicted it, in reports dated 2 years before the disaster, in memos that identified the specific failures that would later cause the leak, the non-functional refrigeration, the bypass scrubber, the disconnected flare tower, the inadequate training of operators, the lack of emergency planning. The water that entered tank 610 did not enter by accident. It entered because a system designed to prevent contamination had been disabled to save money, and the person who authorized the disabling had signed a document that ended up in a file, that ended up in a courtroom, and the courtroom spent years debating what the signature meant. The word accident implies that no one could have known. The people who worked at the plant knew. The people who managed the plant knew. The people who owned the plant knew enough to know that their plant in West Virginia was safer than their plant in Bhopal, and they accepted that difference as a condition of doing business in a country where the regulations were weaker and the liability was lower and the workers were cheaper. That is not an accident. That is a calculation. The survivors who still live with the consequences of that calculation are the living evidence that the system has never fully been held accountable. The $470 million settlement, paid out in installments, distributed unevenly, contested in courts for years, worked out to roughly $550 per claimant, less than the cost of the spirometer that now measures the lung function of their grandchildren. The one criminal conviction of a lower-level plant manager who served less than 2 years stands as the entire legal reckoning for an event that killed somewhere between 2,259 and 25,000 people, depending on who is counting and what they count as a death. The executives who made the decisions that led to the disaster died free and wealthy and in possession of their reputations. And the question of whether their decisions constituted negligence or homicide or something in between was never resolved in any court that had the power to hold them in a room and demand an answer. The clinic in J.P. Nagar closes at 5:00 p.m. The woman and her daughter walk home through streets that are crowded with motorcycles and vegetable carts and children in school uniforms. The air is warm and thick with the smell of cooking oil and diesel exhaust and dust. The daughter is not coughing today. She will cough tomorrow or the day after, when the weather changes or the wind shifts or some invisible threshold in her lungs is crossed, and her mother will recognize the sound because it is the same sound her own mother made. The same sound she has made her entire life. The cough of Bhopal lung disease. The cough of an archive that keeps no paper but stores its records in the soft tissue of the airway and the small passages of the bronchi and the delicate membranes where oxygen passes into blood. The archive does not close. It breathes, and it waits, and it asks the same question it has been asking since the night of December 3, 1984, whether the people who created this archive will ever be required to read it. The photograph is undated, but the reporter's file says 2018. A low sun presses through the haze behind the rusted flare tower, the steel lattice thin as bone against the orange sky. The ground is muddy and littered with broken glass that catches the light in small, accidental constellations. In the distance, the lights of Bhopal are coming on, pinpricks spreading across a city of 2 million, the same air moving through every open window, the same air that once turned chemical on a single December night 34 years before. The flare tower was supposed to burn off the poison before it touched the lungs of the city. It was disconnected for repairs on the night it was needed, and it has never been repaired since. The photograph does not show movement, but the ruin feels alive in a way that is difficult to name, not alive like a recovering body, but alive like an argument that refuses to end. The plant was officially closed in 1998, 14 years after the cloud moved through the narrow lanes of Chola and J.P. Nagar and the railway station 14 years after the hospitals filled with patients whose lungs made sounds no textbook had recorded. The machinery stopped. But closure of a legal entity is not the same as removal of a physical fact. The concrete foundations of the methyl isocyanate storage tanks were left in place. The tank that held the designation 610, the one where water entered a chemical it should never have touched and started a reaction that would rewrite the meaning of industrial safety, is gone, but the slab that cradled it remains. Vegetation has crept over the concrete, tendrils of bougainvillea and stubborn grass finding cracks that opened long after the last worker walked away. Graffiti has accumulated in layers, names, slogans, dates, accusations in Hindi and English, Some faded to pastel, some fresh enough to have been sprayed the week before the photograph. The site is not a memorial in any official sense, but it has become one anyway, a monument that no government dedicated, that no company acknowledges, that no settlement fund keeps clean. In 2004, the Indian government announced a plan to relocate the toxic waste. Thousands of tons of contaminated soil, spent catalysts, chemical residues, and storage vessel leftovers had been sitting on the property for 2 decades, exposed to monsoon rains that carried mercury, lead, chlorinated hydrocarbons, and methyl isocyanate breakdown products into the groundwater beneath the surrounding neighborhoods. The announcement promised a secure disposal facility, a final burial for the chemical ghost. The plan was delayed by legal challenges over which state would accept the waste, by cost disputes between the central government and the state of Madhya Pradesh, by political disagreements that turned the waste into a bargaining chip in unrelated negotiations. As of 2024, the waste remains on the original site. The containers are sealed, but the seal is a temporary gesture against a permanent problem. Nothing grows there in the soil that matters. The vegetation on the concrete is a surface illusion, roots finding purchase above the contamination, while the ground itself remains a reservoir of substances that have no natural half-life in human tissue. The Bhopal Memorial Hospital was supposed to be the other half of the answer. Built in 2007 with funds from the 1989 settlement, the hospital was designed to provide ongoing medical care to the survivors, to study the long-term effects of methyl isocyanate exposure, to give the city's damaged lungs a place where the damage was understood. The hospital has faced chronic underfunding from the start. Staffing shortages mean that specialists are stretched across caseloads that would overwhelm a hospital 3 times the size. Accusations of mismanagement have trailed the institution for years. Equipment bought and never maintained. Research protocols approved and never funded. Patient records lost to administrative negligence. And many survivors say they cannot afford to receive treatment at the facility that was built for them. The consultation fees, the cost of medications not covered by the settlement's dwindling compensation, the transportation from the outlying neighborhoods to the hospital gates, all of it adds up to a quiet arithmetic that keeps the sick away from the place designed to heal them. The paradox is not that the hospital exists and fails. It is that the hospital exists and fails in the same city where tens of thousands of people still carry methyl isocyanate's signature in their bronchial tissue, and the failure has become ordinary. The legal aftermath is a ledger that will not balance. The disaster killed somewhere between 2,500 and 25,000 people, depending on how you count, over what span of years, and whom you ask to certify the cause of death. It injured hundreds of thousands more in ways that continue to compound across generations. The global chemical industry, the Indian government, the insurance markets, and the courts processed the event into a settlement, $470 million in 1989, paid in installments, the sum amounting to less than $500 per claimant at the time, the average payout eventually settling around $550 per person. Union Carbide's insurance policy for the Bhopal plant had a face value of $500 million, meaning the settlement almost exactly matched the maximum the company's insurer would pay. Union Carbide itself bore almost no financial penalty beyond what it had already insured against, and the company later claimed the payout as a tax write-off in the United States. The accounting was clean. The human cost never fit inside the columns. And then the matter of accountability. Exactly one criminal conviction resulted from the disaster. A lower-level plant manager, a man who was on shift that night and who had no authority over the decisions that disabled the refrigeration unit, bypassed the scrubber, disconnected the flare tower, or approved the storage of 40 metric tons of methyl isocyanate in a densely populated city. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and released after serving less than the full term. Every executive involved in the decisions that led to the disaster, the safety systems that were designed in West Virginia and downgraded in Bhopal, the cost-cutting that turned a chemical plant into a liability waiting for a spark, died free, wealthy, and never held to account in any courtroom. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide at the time, was charged with culpable homicide in India, but the United States never extradited him. He lived another 30 years in Florida and New York, and he died in 2014 a country where his name was associated with a corporate tax strategy rather than a mass casualty. The asymmetry is not hidden in obscure legal doctrine. It is visible from the street, from the hospital waiting room, from the photograph of the abandoned flare tower. The law found one man small enough to punish and called the case closed. The photograph catches only the ruin, but the ruin is not the whole story. Behind the flare tower, beyond the broken glass and the graffiti and the concrete slabs, the lights of Bhopal are coming on. 2 million people breathe the air that blew over the plant site that afternoon. The groundwater beneath their homes still carries the chemical fingerprint of the disaster, and a Supreme Court order in 2014 directed the state government to provide clean drinking water to the affected communities, acknowledging that the contamination was irreversible. The order was not fully implemented. More than a decade later, many families still rely on water that contains the ghost of the cloud that killed their parents. The same molecule that was sprayed on American tomato plants in the 1970s, and that required a chemical so volatile it could not be shipped through the mail, ended its journey here, in the wells and the soil and the lungs of a generation that had no choice about living downwind. The distance between a suburban hardware store and the Chola neighborhood is not geographical alone. It is a distance measured in regulatory codes, in insurance premiums, and the difference between what a company knows and what it chooses to act upon. The Bhopal disaster is often described as the worst industrial accident in history. That description is a kind of closure too. An accident is an unforeseeable event, a bolt from a clear sky, a tragedy that no one could have prevented. But the record shows a different shape. The safety systems that failed were not broken by some act of God. They were deliberately bypassed, deactivated, or removed for cost-saving reasons. The plant's own operating manual recommended against storing methyl isocyanate in the quantities that were stored. The company's internal safety audit in 1982 identified more than 20 serious hazards, none of which were fully corrected. The plant was operating at a financial loss, and by 1984, Union Carbide was actively seeking a buyer, a fact that did not create an incentive to invest in safety repairs. The cloud that moved across the sleeping city at 1 a.m. on December 3 was not an accident in any meaningful sense. It was a consequence, slowly assembled, precisely documented, and allowed to mature until the pressure gauge passed the red line and there was nothing left to do but run. The archive does not close with an answer. It closes with a question that remains suspended in the air over every industrial city in the world, over every factory fence that separates a chemical tank from a primary school, over every boardroom where the cost of a safety upgrade is weighed against the cost of a potential settlement. When the next warning sign appears, the pressure gauge climbing, the scrubber turned off for maintenance, the flare tower disconnected for repairs, The refrigeration unit's silent for 3 months. Will we read it before the clouds gather? Or will we wait until the air turns chemical again? The ground beneath the plant is still poisoned. The hospital is still underfunded. The waste is still waiting to be moved. And the city, every night, turns on its lights. The pressure gauge on tank 610 climbed beyond the red line, and no alarm sounded because the alarm had been disconnected. The siren that could have warned a sleeping city was silenced by a decision that prioritized order over information. Decades later, a spirometer in a clinic in J.P. Nagar traced a curve identical to the one recorded by a mother who breathed the cloud in 1984, and then by her daughter born the following year, and now by her granddaughter. The water from the well still carries benzene at 250 times the safe limit. What was found below was not a single failure but a slow accumulation of choices, each one rational on its balance sheet, each one pushing the cost of progress onto bodies that never signed the ledger. The truth that became visible is that the chemical that protected crops required a precursor so volatile it could not be shipped through the mail, and that paradox, a useful thing carrying a hidden cost, was built into the concrete before the first tank was filled. The evidence changed nothing in the corporate archives, but it changed the archive of the lungs. Every breath a record, every cough a page. Now the pressure eases. The darkness thins. The hatch opens to cold sea air and a sky that holds no cloud but the memory of one. The file closes, but the recovered evidence remains with us. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The archive breathes in Bhopal. It asks nothing but to be read.